you everybody for coming. I especially appreciate this on a Saturday morning that's as beautiful as this one. We have two really great panels this morning, so I think we ought to get started as soon as we can. I have a pretty easy job here as the moderator, and it's mostly to give you some housekeeping information. The first thing is we're going to have a break at 10:30, so if you are wondering when you get more coffee, that's it. Lunch is going to be at 12:30, and it's going to be in the cafe, which is to the right. And then we're going to adjourn at 1:30. If you weren't here yesterday, restrooms are located just outside the doors in this direction, and food breaks are going to be in here. So, reminder about the media and the press. We are really delighted to have many members of the media among us. The ground rules for press coverage are that all presentations and the general discussion held during the conference session are on the record. Any informal social aspects of our gathering, conversation over the breaks or during lunch, are off the record unless otherwise agreed to by the parties. Here's the other important thing. We will be live streaming the conference sessions and plan to make the video available on the Fed website. All presentations and comments made during the general session discussions will be recorded. So, when we're in this session, if you say it out loud, all sorts of other people could hear it. At some time during the day, we hope you will complete the conference evaluation. They should be in the program packets, and we hope you will return them to the registration table just outside. You have the bios for the speakers in your packets, and so I'm just going to turn it over to our first speaker, Matt Kahn.
Folks, good morning, and I bring good news. I am not going to give an econometric paper. Hey, thank you and good night. Folks, over 40 years ago, two Nobel laureates, Bill Nordhaus and Jim Tobin, wrote a paper, Is Growth Obsolete? And in this paper, they talked about that is GDP a sufficient statistic for our quality of life? And they argued no, that there's factors like pollution and congestion, and that we should factor in these disamenities when judging whether life is getting better. I was a Sherwin Rosen and Gary Becker student at the University of Chicago, and these great scholars were thinking through what is quality of life? In a world where we don't have a time machine, how do we know? If we had a market for time machines, we could do... Thank you. We could do very well measuring progress and quality of life. If we had a market for passports, we could rank nations with respect to quality of life. Folks, in a world of incomplete markets where we don't have a time machine, I'm waiting for Elon Musk to raise his game. In a world where we sort of have markets for passports, but I don't know the prices. Yeah, tough room. How do we go about ranking quality of life? Is life getting better? In the early 1990s, was working on this literature as from a University of Chicago perspective, that I see where you move to, and by revealed preference, that reveals who you are. I'm going to come back as an older, more seasoned man, a better man, but a declining man, with some new insights on an old literature. Folks, non-market local public goods. I'm an urban economist. Robert Lucas, a long time ago, explained to me that I'm not a macroeconomist. I posed to Professor Lucas an idea related to his work, and he told me, don't work on that. And I, from that point on, became a microeconomist. And there are non-market local public goods that improve our quality of life. San Francisco's mild climate, good public schools, clean air, clean water, safe streets. These are inputs in a Beckerian household production function of creating safety and comfort. Bullet point number 2, at any point in time, cities differ with respect to their attributes along these dimensions, and neighborhoods vary along these dimensions. Folks, the third bullet point is one of the key points I want to raise, and if you follow this third point, you can then check your email. This is a free country. When, as a Sherwin Rosen student, I was approaching this, that each young adult chooses a location based on her preferences, and that's that. But as Raj Chetty's important work highlights, there's this bundling. When a parent chooses a neighborhood with young children, you're simultaneously making a consumption decision for yourself and an investment decision in your children. Bottom bullet point, early quality of life exposure is a key investment in children's futures. And this is going to be one of my big themes in this big think piece. Folks, the logic of urban quality of life. The compensating differentials model, which all the microeconomists in the room know, is that higher quality products sell for a higher price. A Mercedes is more expensive than some Volvo car, and San Francisco is more expensive than Baltimore. The folks who choose to be in San Francisco versus Baltimore, who could have afforded both products, by revealed preference are indicating something about the relative utilities of these two differentiated products. Urban economists use spatial variation in wages and rents to infer how much people are willing to pay for non-market goods such as clean air and street safety. Building on the work of Zvi Griliches and Sherwin Rosen, we estimate these reduced form implicit hedonic prices. And I could write out the regression. I've got a chalkboard here. And we'll talk about this. I'm going to do some hand-waving stuff. So here we go. The key intuition about urban quality of life rankings. Folks, suppose you have data for every neighborhood and every city in the United States on its wages that Matt would earn, the taxes that I would face, and the rents that I would pay to live in such a place. Imagine a place where Matt would be offered a low salary, would face high taxes, and would face high rents for living there. If Matt chooses to live in this place with low wages, high taxes, and high rents, i.e. very little pizza for me to consume, if I choose as a free man to live there, it must be a kick-ass place, if I can use some technical economics language. Folks, do you see the revealed preference measured in slices of pizza, measured in terms of the opportunity cost? Pizza, the composite commodity. If I sacrifice a lot of pizza to be there, it must be great. Folks, there's been a challenge in the empirical literature. It's easy to get Zillow data. Zillow is happy to share all this real estate data with you. A weakness in this literature, and I was guilty of this also, is the following Heckman selection issue. I know the earnings that I'm being paid right now at Johns Hopkins. I don't know what the University of Kansas would pay me to join their faculty. In cities that I've never lived in, if I don't know what I would be paid there, and if the econometrician doesn't know what the economic agent would be paid to live there, we face issues of doing revealed preference if I can't impute your earnings in places you've never lived in. And so a weakness in this literature where I've been an active participant is to completely punt on self-selection. So let me say this again, since folks are starting to check their cell phones. Think of the superstar economists in New York right now, Jeff Sachs, Don Davis, Paul Krugman. Can we infer what their earnings would be in Mississippi from the set of people there? Implicit in this literature is you can just average over the same subsets of people, and that sketches out the budget constraint. Folks, this is B+ stuff. And so this literature has kind of stalled because of this inability to impute the budget constraint. If you bother to read my paper, I cite this paper by Carolyn Minter-Huxby, Chris Avery, and one other co-author, where they do a revealed preference of people's college rankings. So if you get into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and if Yale and Princeton offer you a free ride, but Harvard makes you pay full tuition, and you go to Harvard, we can tell who's number one there. Do I have to finish the proof? And so, so because they have complete information on the nonlinear budget constraints and observe the choice you make, they can do the revealed preference exercise much more easily than the urban literature can. Folks, I now want to talk about supply and demand. We had a great day yesterday, but there wasn't that much talk about equilibrium. So, from my Chicago training, there was supply and demand. In a paper, on the demand side, we are risk averse, and as we grow richer, we want more safety and comfort. I look around this room, I see folks who want safety and comfort. So Dora and I wrote the following paper 15 years ago that's generated a lot of cites, and this is in the Sherwin Rosen, Richard Thaler, Russian roulette tradition. Folks, what the value of life literature says is the following. If I have a gun with 100 chambers and I put one bullet into the gun, and I say to you, how much would I have to pay you to pull the trigger? There's a 1 in 100 chance of death. And so if you said $17,000, then by linearity, under linearity, you're valuing your life, the value of a statistical life, is $1.7 million. What Dora and I do in this paper in sort of the Kit Viscusi compensating differentials style is we estimate the same wage regression every decade. We're basically looking at what is the wage premium for coal miners who face extra death risk on the job. And we document that the value of a statistical life is rising faster than GNP. And this finding that this survival is a luxury good has been found in many cases, generating hundreds of sites for this great stuff. But folks, more interesting is the supply side. And I know there's a couple of industrial organization economists here. And this is actually a major weakness in modern urban economics. Folks, in industrial organization, there is supply and demand. So there's a demand for differentiated products. A differentiated product might be a car, a refrigerator. On the supply side, there's a for-profit firm choosing what to bundle into a Mercedes. The CEO of this firm is thinking through the costs and benefits of what attributes to bundle into a Mercedes. Should you put in an airbag? Should there be a second cell phone? Should there be special aromas? Tough room. What is bundled into San Francisco? God has bundled in the current climate and mountains, but who bundled in these homeless guys? Who bundled in this pollution? Who bundled in the traffic congestion in Los Angeles or the crime in West Baltimore? These are emergent byproducts of a zillion independent decisions. There's no intelligent design, or there's little intelligent design in a city of what's bundled into this. And so when thinking about the supply side, if San Francisco is so great, why can't we make another one? Las Vegas shows that you can reproduce some attributes of cities, have excellent restaurants, even in a moonscape of recreating some very interesting combinations. An awkward issue, and I'm going to be coming back to Raj Chetty's work in a couple of minutes, is that the poverty rate for a neighborhood, given that we don't have a formal supply side for modeling the supply, the structural supply of local attributes that we then pay for in the wage and rent equilibrium, there is the belief and the objective reality that areas with higher poverty rates have lower quality of life. Folks, something I want you to think about is whether this is a selection effect or a treatment effect. Raj Chetty's work has been about moving poor people to better neighborhoods. If there is the belief among homeowner voters that if more poor people move in, that this will lower quality of life, they're going to oppose these people moving to their neighborhood. And so while this is a sensitive topic, it's actually crucial to think about the correlation between poverty and quality of life. Let me start here. So I want to talk about, so again, where I'm going is as this negative correlation between the poverty rate and quality of life. The sorting story goes as follows. Poor people have lower income, and in a capitalism, nicer things cost more. And so it's a selection effect that poor people sort into these neighborhoods. And an old-style Chicago economist would say this is a choice. A libertarian would say they have chosen to take private consumption over local public goods. That is their choice. Chris Timmons and others have been doing work on discrimination, that certain groups face constraints on their choice set that go beyond income, and that certain groups might be systematically sorting into low quality of life areas because of racial steering. In that case, projects like Raj Chetty is doing in Seattle with his co-authors of using concierge services to steer renters with vouchers to better neighborhoods can help to overcome this. Folks, in a paper that you haven't read by Denise DiPasquale and me, how many of you have read this? Illiterates. Oh, Amy.
Not in a while.
All right. What Denise and I did was the following. And Real Estate Economics, top 5 journal in my mind. Tough room. We look at white, black, in Los Angeles. We partition Los Angeles using 1990 census data into 58 Pumas. Those are our neighborhoods, and these are big neighborhoods, but there's 58 of them. Controlling for household income and demographics, we ask, holding income constant, do whites, blacks, and Hispanics move into similarly high-quality neighborhoods? And blacks and Hispanics, relative to whites, are moving to areas with higher crime, worse air pollution, worse schools. And so there's this clear gap, even controlling for income between races in investing in quality of life. And going back to my first slide, this has implications for their children growing up in this environment. We in a conference on geographic divide have to talk about, are we libertarians and this is just a choice they made? Or is this a constrained choice where perhaps that's not Pareto optimal? I want to come back. I think I want to do it like this. I'll double back. I don't have a slide on the following. The more politically incorrect point about the correlation of the poverty rate and quality of life being negative is the treatment effect. As I talk about in my paper, if poor people move to a neighborhood, when could that lower quality of life? There are concerns that crime rises when more poor people move in. There's concerns, Ed Lazier has a paper in the JPE, if you write down an O-ring theory of school quality, if there's one disruptive kid in a school, if that kid can mess up the classroom, if poor people, in a probabilistic sense, if a poor kid is more likely to be that kid, then by introducing more poor people, you raise the probability of the weakest link being weaker. And so there's legitimate questions, they're sensitive questions, but there's legitimate questions to be asked about the causal effect of if an area has more poor people, what happens to its quality of life? And as I talk about in the paper, even if that is false, if homeowners believe that it's true, they're going to use their power to block poor people from moving into their areas. I love Raj Chetty's agenda. I don't know if it's been, Raj has 3 times my IQ, we're on videotape. There needs to be a political economy discussion of identifying those tolerant communities most willing to welcome these individuals. So Scott Commoners of Harvard Business School has been doing work on mechanism design in the field of refugee settlement. With the Syrian refugees, why did it take so long to settle these people? Why didn't we use Al Roth's mechanism design to figure out which areas in Europe had the least distaste to welcome them and reward these communities for doing so? I want us thinking through the same issues as we think about moving poor people out of poor places. Where do we want the poor to live is something I hope we discuss later. I'm worried about the following, and I've learned this from Ed Glazer and in my own work. I'm worried that one of the reasons that quality of life inequality might rise in America in a time of superstar cities is that we are pushing the poor to live in poor areas. Folks, there's a lot of work going on in urban economics right now on local land use regulation. In my own work, I have found that progressive cities are more likely to engage in these land use regulations that effectively give you an inelastic supply curve for housing. In areas where demand is rising with inelastic supply, you get higher home prices, and this excludes the poor, pushing poor people away from these areas, pushing the middle class away from these areas. There's a cross-elasticity of moving to lower quality of life cities. We continue to have public housing in this country, and this self-segregates the poor. Folks, Jim Rausch and Enrico Moretti and Ed Glazer so here is an econometric regression with terrible notation. In urban economics, what many folks do is they estimate a regression for person I in city J of her wages as a function of her skills and of the city's average skill. So if Matt Kahn moves to a high-skill city, researchers have found that beta 2 is positive, that there is a spillover effect of living in a high human capital city. Ed Glazer has written a lot on this, and Enrico Moretti has done some of the better econometrics instrumenting for a city's average human capital level. But what has been downplayed in this literature is this means that if the poor live in a poor place, they're not gaining this benefit, that inequality is going up. When the skilled live in a skilled city, their wages are rising. I think in the face of these spillovers, both positive and negative, we need to have a discussion. Where do we want the poor to live? For their own good and for everyone else's as we try to continue economic growth and reduce inequality. I skipped over this slide. Because the quality of life literature made 2 mistakes thinking back 20 years. There was the assumption of zero migration costs, and there was the implicit assumption that everyone was a renter and that there were these absentee landlords. What's very interesting, and we spoke about this at length yesterday, is we talked about dynamics, shocks hitting places. There's also quality of life shocks. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s during a very rough time, and my father kicks himself that he didn't purchase property that when it was basically free. Baltimore housing is very cheap right now. And Dora keeps emailing me saying, Matt, don't start buying Baltimore real estate. You don't know what you're doing. I listen to my wife. The quality of life of areas changes over time, whether there's the falling crime revolution, there's been successful environmental regulation. If Baltimore could be connected to Washington, D.C. by a fast train, we've learned from my work in China on high-speed rail of what that does to second-tier cities. Incumbent homeowners bear the incidence of new news. If you own a property in New York and crime falls sharply, you gain a sharp appreciation in home value, like in Harlem's brownstones. This is especially likely to be the case if it's difficult to build new housing. The early quality of life literature assumed zero migration costs, such that we were all on the margin and ready to get up and go. In truth, we all plant roots as we age. And so we were talking about it yesterday several times of people making place-based bets with where their social networks are, where their mother is. And we make place-based bets such that we become more and more insensitive. We're making a bet that the city we live in will continue to be great, and we can't hedge that bet of what assets you can buy to hedge that risk you face locally. And so that interests me very much, and Sherwin Rosen and I never discussed this issue of how you diversify this risk. So I started my talk talking about Bill Nordhaus and Jim Tobin's work on Is Growth Obsolete? And 47 years ago, they were well aware that there's more to life than GNP. Pete Clino and Chad Jones had this recent AER where they benchmarked France, China, and the United States, and they took China down a peg. The way I read their paper is there's three dimensions in their work, life expectancy, leisure, and GNP, and France looks much better when you factor in these three criteria. Tough room. Urban economists, including myself for now almost 30 years, have continued to use revealed preference methods. A strict libertarian would say, if somebody chooses to live in the poorest part of Baltimore, God bless. They have taken a rent of zero, and they're free to choose. Looking around, I don't see any Friedmanites. You can't judge a book by its cover. We as economists face a serious issue of revealed preference is one of the major tools we have. When I see you make a choice, what have I learned about you hinges on what the choice set was and what information you have, and are you aware of the long-run impacts on you and your children? So I think there's a key synergy going forward between Raj Chetty's agenda on Move to Opportunity, Jim Heckman's work on the child dynamic complementarity model, and parents' choice of neighborhood quality of life. And so I think when Chris Foote first contacted me, I thought I was going to give sort of a post-mortem on a literature that is now done, but I'm back. And I now see that this is a very important topic, but the new older me sees that in a world of migration costs, in a world of asymmetric information, in a world of spillovers, that this is actually a much harder issue of thinking about, for each American, what is our demand for quality of life, and why is the supply of good neighborhoods so inelastic? What can be done to increase the supply of good neighborhoods in good cities? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's going to be a tough act to follow at 9:20 in the morning on a Saturday. Anyways, super interesting, Matt. Thank you. So our paper, joint with Sergio Pinto, who's here as well, is trying to look at this issue of geographic disparities from the perspective of well-being metrics. So how do people experience economic processes? How do economic processes affect their daily lives? And then what are the broader welfare effects? And this is an approach, I think, that's come a long way since we first started sort of bluntly using happiness surveys about 20 years ago in economics, and now we really measure a lot of different dimensions of well-being, and ranging from daily experience or hedonic well-being to how people evaluate their lives as a whole, to even things like meaning and purpose in people's lives, autonomy, all kinds of other things. And I think it's a particularly good approach for addressing questions that revealed preferences don't answer very well. So raising some of the issues that Matt was raising about choice. So I think a lot about situations where people don't have the agency to make a choice, whether because of poor information or because addiction or self-control problems or discrimination, whatever it might be. And so I've been thinking about, when we've been talking about geographic disparities in places that are declining but people stay, and then who moves and why do they move or why don't they move. And I think thinking about stayers and leavers within the context of how much choice they have to stay or leave may explain some of what we find. And then I also think a lot about the welfare effects of macro and institutional arrangements individuals are powerless to change. So how do they reveal a choice? And again, if you think about a lot of the labor market changes that are going on right now, there are people who have skills and all kinds of ways to adapt and take advantage of these changes, but there are a lot of people that don't. And they're the people that tend to get left behind, drop out, do whatever. So the work we are involved in now, and some of which we're presenting today, is also a new departure in most of the work on well-being, in that we don't just think about happiness and unhappiness, but we're thinking about hope and despair, right? So hope for the future, optimism, or lack thereof. And we find that those are more important markers when we think about the people who are left behind in deprived places. And the other thing we're trying to do, which is a difficult thing, so it's by definition imperfect, is to think about things about place that also affect well-being. And so they're difficult to observe and difficult to measure, but somehow they matter. And a lot of the conversation yesterday dwelled on why is it that people want to be in rural places, and it was all about things like community or non-income amenities that make a place a nice place to be. But I think that what we're really trying to understand better is this whole role of community and why that makes some places better for some people than others. So just very quickly, I think about it, sort of the problem and the puzzles. Our standard indicators tell this great story, right? Booming stock market, record low levels of unemployment, low inflation, relatively high growth, and yet, as the point of this conference, there's a lot of disparity. So we think about 15 to 20% of prime age males out of the labor force, and significant sectors of society dying prematurely from the deaths of despair that have been the topic of a lot of discussion. And something is not quite right. And then if you just look at the US compared to other countries of comparable income levels, our average life satisfaction have dropped about 10 points. We're now, I think, 17 or 18 in the World Happiness Report rankings. I don't put too much stock into these country level rankings, but I think a significant drop over 10 years suggests something going on. And we tend to have higher levels of inequality of well-being compared to other countries of comparable income levels. And then Americans report more pain on a daily basis than people in 30 countries of comparable and lower levels of income. That's a puzzle. Why? Why do Americans have more pain than people in much poorer countries? And then one of the things that really stands out in our findings is that desperation and lack of hope, and then the associated trends in premature mortality, are concentrated among less than college educated whites, right? There are some upticks in deaths in minorities, but they tend to not be the same kind of deaths. And what we see is that poor minorities remain very optimistic about the future, in very strong contrast to poor whites. And then something that has been the subject of the whole conference is that there's a lot of geographic dispersion. We find that it's not just a story of urban-rural or urban versus the heartland, although it very much is, but also that racially and economically diverse places, and that's both factors, tend to be more optimistic and to have lower instances of premature mortality. So what we did in some earlier work is we matched our trends in well-being and ill-being, so lack of worry, hope, reported pain, other markers, but these really stood out, with those on the deaths of despair at the level of individuals and places. So we had the county level mortality rate, and we could look at where, if people lived in certain kinds of counties, which included racial composition and everything else, whether they were more or less likely to be in the deaths of despair category. And we found really strong matches between these markers of well-being and ill-being and where the deaths of despair were, suggesting that tracking well-being might be a good way to monitor the health of your society before you get, to the point that you have premature mortality or mortality rate going up rather than down. Again, something we've talked about a lot over the past day. The other thing that we find, and this was the first finding that surprised us, was how much more optimistic poor minorities were than poor whites. And this is before even the deaths of despair. We found that that poor blacks, this is only poor groups, and the left out group here is poor whites, but we found that poor blacks were almost an entire standard deviation higher on, this is a future life satisfaction question, which is very much a proxy for raw optimism, much more optimistic than poor whites. Hispanics were also more optimistic, but the gap wasn't as big. And then if you look at reported stress, you get the opposite pattern. So poor blacks were much less likely to report stress the previous day, and Hispanics also a little bit less likely than poor whites. And we know, objectively speaking, that poor blacks and poor Hispanics face more objective disadvantages most days. So it's not that they have less objective stress, but they must be more resilient to it. So we've been trying to explore this finding, and not surprisingly, it links to their lack of representation in the deaths of despair category. And then we've also tried to look at broader geographic patterns and how they reflect our well-being metrics. And this is a very imperfect art, but it's suggestive anyway. And what we did in this work is we controlled for, this is state level because it's the only way we have enough observations. This is based on Gallup data. But we controlled for everything we could control for: age, race, gender, marital status, education, everything except income, and found the places where minorities were the most optimistic and where whites were more optimistic. And if you look at the minorities graph, which is on the right, darker green is more optimistic. And there's somewhat of a puzzle in these maps, because the most optimistic places for minorities are the southeastern cluster of states, which we know have terrible objective indicators, poor health, lots of poverty, all kinds of racism, lots of problems, and yet there's this huge sort of residual optimism effect. And the other place that's very dark green are the southwestern cluster of states. But if you think about these places, there's a concentration in the former of African American culture, music, churches. There's something else. If you think we're controlling for objective indicators, there's something else about that concentration of community that seems to have a positive effect for well-being or optimism. And the same goes for the concentration of Hispanics in the Southwest. So we're trying to understand place better. It's not necessarily easy, but we're still trying to figure out more about it. And a lot of what we'll report now is suggestive anyway. So Shannon Monat, who Laszlo mentioned yesterday, finds that counties, in addition to what we're talking about, that counties with higher levels of poverty, obesity, deaths due to drug, alcohol, and suicide, reliance on disability, and percent of non-Hispanic whites, this is a recurring pattern, are also the same places with high levels of Trump voting. And some of the things that we've found is that places, and others have also found, colleagues of ours, that if you look at counties that with high levels of switching, so voting for Trump in places that had been moderately Republican before, they had drops in life satisfaction, and more importantly, drops in optimism in the 5 years before the election. So that, this is kind of trying to introduce desperation back into this story. And the last point is some newer work we've been doing coming out in GBO on based on PSID data, overtime data, and we find that respondents born between 1935 and 1945 who reported to be optimistic in their 20s are much more likely to be alive in 2015 than the non-optimists. The other trend that's really interesting is, because we have this many years of data, is that blacks and women increased their reported optimism in the 1970s. women weren't increasing reported happiness, as Betsy can tell you, but optimism did go up at the same time. And these are the times that civil rights and gender rights changed. And the one group that experienced decreases in optimism beginning in the late 70s were less than college-educated white males. So this corresponds with the decline in manufacturing. So these are longer-term trends. They're not, I think, as recent as we think, although they're manifesting themselves more now, or more extremely now. And then the last thing is we've also been doing some pilot surveys that should suggest links between hope and investments in the future in deprived communities. So hope seems to matter. It's a fuzzy concept. It's not easy to just quantify in economic terms, but we are trying. So what we explored in this paper is we dug a bit deeper on particular cohorts. We were thinking about kind of cohorts and places that go together. So the first was out of the labor force population with a focus on men. The second was on mobility, and here we're thinking about intergenerational and geographic mobility, and then differences across rural, micropolitan, and metropolitan counties, all from the perspective of well-being. How am I doing on time? Great, thank you. And then the other thing we added in are some new indicators in the Gallup data on how people assess their financial well-being, their social well-being, and these are all split into sub-indicators: purpose and community level well-being, and then quite significant information on objective and selective and self-reported health, and these range from just how satisfied you are with your health to distinct, have you been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z? So they're a mix of objective and subjective health, not in the same indices. And if you want detail on the indices, these are all in the appendix of our paper. And then finally, an issue that this work relates to, although we don't know that much about it, a lot of good information came out yesterday, is the explanations for the lower levels of geographic mobility in the US today versus a few decades ago. But I think our findings reflect this reduced mobility. And this is very much work in progress. So our data is the Gallup Healthways, which is a cross-sectional, it's nationally representative survey that's collected on a daily basis. So we have a lot of observations for adults in the US. We use 2010 to 2016 data. The later years have some changes in method that we still have to adapt for. And then we use well-being, obviously, as the key outcome variable, and then we have all this standard socioeconomic and demographic data. And then in some specifications, we're adding in county-level data, so intergenerational, both relative and absolute, from the Raj Chetty data, the share of people living in their parents' home per county, the share of people living in their childhood census tract per county, and then other things like teenage birth rate. We also add in the mortality rate for 35 to 64-year-olds following the Case-Deaton classification from the CDC, and then a whole bunch of other county-level controls. So the first thing we looked at was prime-age males out of the labor force, or out of the labor force population with a focus on males. And what we found, without going into all the details of the equations, the first specification, we looked at just different labor force categories, and we found that, so we compare, we were looking at unemployed, out of the labor force, self-employed, employed part-time, once full-time, part-time, so forth. And then we focused on just prime-age populations, and we looked specifically across gender and labor market status, and then finally we looked only at prime-age males, and we looked across race. So obviously ignore the many numbers because you probably can't read them, but just to give you a flavor of the results, for the full sample, where we were just looking across labor market categories, we found that being unemployed is associated with the worst evaluative and hedonic well-being indicators. But prime age, and then for the out of labor force workers, there were real differences across younger and older counterparts versus prime age males. So prime age males out of the labor force report worse health indicators and worse well-being indicators in many dimensions than the unemployed. And that also suggests that this health thing with prime-age males, we don't really know the direction of causality. Did they drop out of the labor force because they weren't healthy, or do they become unhealthy because they're isolated at home and on opioids? But that's a whole factor really affecting this cohort and its ability to respond to, job offers, or even to desire to respond to job offers, which is obviously a puzzle in today's labor market. Out of labor force youth are quite optimistic because they're probably in school. And older out of labor force people were also not particularly troubled compared to the prime age males, prime age labor workers in general. So when we look at gender, then we get some pretty interesting differences. So prime age males out of the labor force have very low markers of well-being, as I mentioned before. They're close to those of unemployed males, and many of them are worse, so they have less optimism, more sadness, less smiling, all kinds of things compared to unemployed males. But women in all labor market categories have higher levels of well-being than men, including women employed full-time. But the biggest differences across gender are in these more deprived labor market categories. So OLF women are much less likely to have a whole range of negative well-being markers than OLF men. And I think that's because of different dropout reasons. And when you look at the percent of prime age workers out of the labor force that are caregivers, about 30% of them are, and most of them are women. And so at least if they're out of the labor force, women have a purpose. It may not be a great life or a great job, but they have something to do, versus Kruger's time use survey shows that a lot of prime age males out of the labor force spend most of their time playing video games, and obviously that's a pretty toxic combination for your well-being. And then when we look across race, we find that that it really is white prime age males who have the lowest markers of well-being across all dimensions. And then blacks and Hispanics have higher well-being than whites within every labor market status and across almost every well-being indicator. But the biggest gaps are again in these the more deprived labor market categories, unemployed and out of the labor force. So it seems that whites, when they're in, when they're not in good straits, they're much more affected by not having good jobs or not having jobs or being out of the labor force. And what explains this? Again, a bit of a puzzle. I think in part it's because it's this very strong, the blue collar American dream, image. You work hard, you get ahead, and everybody that is falling behind is a loser. They're not trying, and all of a sudden they're falling behind, and they don't have a narrative. Right? They don't have a narrative to explain that. Versus if you think about minorities, minorities have traditionally faced discrimination and have had to build community ties and other ties, coping mechanisms, and those serve them well, I think. Anyway, that's not a full explanation, but that's at least one potential answer for that. And then the other thing is, it seems that prime age white males are also more vulnerable to opioids. They're much more likely to reside in counties with higher opioid prescription rates, and they fit sort of the same geographic map that Shannon Monad has found about sort of poor health, opioids, deaths of despair, Trump voting. So the geographic distribution of prime age males, OLF, really reflects this broader geography of desperation. So I have to speed up. So intergenerational and geographic mobility. Let me sort of do a spoiler alert and tell you the main thing. What we really find is that our findings are much more driven by where people live. The geographic here meaning you're still in your parents' census tract or you're still in your parents' home, rather than by our data on absolute and relative mobility. Absolute mobility is the expected rank of children whose parents were at the 25th percentile of national income. So a higher value on that coefficient means more mobility. Relative mobility is the slope from an OLS regression of child rank on parents' rank, and so this is much more confusing to interpret because you have a lower value on relative mobility means more mobility. I won't go into the details of how we did this, it's in the paper, But if essentially what we found when we have all controls, including individual, socioeconomic, all kinds of other controls, county fixed effects, what we found is that the percent of people, the absolute mobility really didn't show much in terms of well-being, because most of the action is being picked up by percent of people living in their parents' homes or percent of people living in a childhood census tract. So percent of people living in their parents' homes are pretty unhappy, and they're often quite unhealthy. So we find that counties with a higher percent of people living in their parents' homes were more likely to have higher negative affect, lower positive affect across all indicators. And if you think about these counties, you probably have an overrepresentation of prime-age males out of the labor force, who we know are also in poor health and have very low well-being. The percent of people living in a childhood census tract is a little more interesting. So it's associated with less optimism. You're still in your where you grew up. You don't have great hopes for the future. Higher negative affect, so more anger, more worry, more stress. But current life satisfaction is actually okay. So it's kind of, I think about this a little bit like happy peasants and frustrated achievers. So you're kind of stuck where you are, you're happy with your community, but you're not going anywhere, and you know it, and your health isn't that good either. So these are when I think about leavers and stayers, these are kind of the content stayers. But if you think about people who are still in their parents' home, they're the not content stayers. Relative mobility, the same thing. Not the action again is where people live. And then one interesting level, two interesting data points. The county level deaths of despair related mortality rate is associated with basically negatively with every single well-being indicator we have. So if you live in a place, in a county with high levels of deaths of despair, your well-being is very low. And then the other thing that we found when we looked at percent of non-Hispanic whites per county, we didn't find a lot, except that non-Hispanic whites seem very satisfied with their communities. So what I draw from that is whites like living with whites. Just putting it out there. That's, I can't explain it, or it's not clear you can do anything about it. But that when we think about a lot of what came up yesterday about the need for immigration and more population in these densely populated counties, that seems to run in the other direction. And also that we find more racially diverse places are more economically vibrant and healthier. The last thing, and I will go through this quickly, we started with some work that Oswald and Wu did on the US a few years ago, in which they were trying to look at how state level well-being was correlated or uncorrelated with state GDP, and they found that with no income controls that you got no correlation at all, but when you controlled for income and sociodemographic traits, state level well-being is actually negatively correlated with state GDP. And this again resonates with some of the discussion we had about some of these rural places having a lot of amenities and other things that people care about, like community well-being. So we looked at 6 county types, MSAs with more than 1 million people, MSAs with between 250,000 and 1 million people, MSAs with less than 250, micropolitan statistical areas, rural counties adjacent to MSAs, which are the rural places that are in yesterday's discussion seem to be the ones that are more likely to thrive, and then rural counties not adjacent to MSAs. And what we found is basically that when we control for sort of the basic controls, age, race, gender, month, state of residence, etc., we found that well-being literally just goes up monotonically as you go from smaller to bigger areas. So the bigger areas display higher markers of well-being, except for community level indicators, where again you get this more rural satisfaction with community. When we control for income, things flip a little bit, and then we find, when we have all controls in, that rural communities do much better in terms of well-being than they did before, except for one significant marker, and that's optimism for the future, right? So metro areas are much more likely, people are much more likely to be optimistic about the future. People are also more stressed, which may reflect higher expectations. So I'm out of time. I think, I'm not going to review what I just said because I'll go over, but the conclusions are what I said summarized, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Our discussant is Betsy Stevenson.
Thank you. It's great to be here talking about these two papers. When I was asked to be a discussion for a session where we were going to start with a paper that used revealed preference and then turn to subjective well-being data, I was pretty excited because when I teach my students about subjective well-being data, I always start by explaining the difference between revealed preference data and subjective well-being data. So it's a good place to start here, right? So we have one way that we've been doing for a really long time and we really believe in, which is revealed preference. So we want to see people put their money where their mouth is. I don't want to trust you when you tell me that you prefer apples to oranges. I want to see what you actually do at the store and whether you're willing to make purchase decisions in a way that show what your preferences are for apples versus oranges. And so, but there is this other idea, which is we could just ask people. What do you like, or how well off are you? And it turns out, economists are very skeptical of this because where are the incentives for you to tell the truth, right? Why should you tell me the truth? But what are the incentives for you to lie? So when it comes to things like subjective well-being, it seems like people do a pretty good job of telling us the truth. And there is this additional sort of beneficial thing, which is that when we're looking at revealed preference, we actually can only look at people who can afford to buy the thing that we want to actually see them reveal their preference on. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges with sort of traditional quality of life measures is thinking through, like, can you afford it and what's your preference for it? So now, with all of that, so here's the question, which is how do we measure whether society is improving living standards for its citizens? And I'm going to start, first off, with just a defense of GDP and income, because I think that it is often the case that we're quick to judge and say, as was Matt said at the beginning, is GDP a sufficient statistic? We should factor in things like pollution, quality of living. We're just not doing a good enough job. And, that's certainly true in theory, right? And that, I'm actually going to do something I hate, which is, oh, now I don't know what just happened. I made my slides disappear. Oh, there we go. It was that I think I'm making them come back. Come back. Well, that serves me right. Well, what I will just, somebody's controlling it. It was not me. Okay, hooray! Yeah. I appreciate that. So, now I just need to be able to advance them. But so let me start with, so it's theoretically the case that, of course, GDP could be terrible, right? We could raise GDP tomorrow by canceling everybody's vacation and making everybody work extra long, and we would get higher GDP, but I think we'd probably get lower well-being. So that's sort of the idea. Now I'm going to do this thing where I skip ahead, and then I'm going to come back. That's the thing I hate. So many things. So income and GDP isn't everything, but it's actually pretty good. So I'm going to come back and actually show you this first fact that GDP is correlated with high levels of subjective well-being, but I really want to say it doesn't have to lead to a higher subjective well-being, and that's why people get very antsy, because it's possible, right? There's the famous Kennedy quote about how GDP doesn't capture things like the joy of our children and the beauty of our surroundings, and so maybe, it'll be a terrible thing. And I actually had this on my slide, which what you said earlier, was like what we really care about is the budget constraint. We really want to understand what choices people can possibly make. And when it comes to GDP, we don't really care. I always tell my students, don't look at my research and think that you should take the job that offers you the highest pay. That's not what I mean when I say that people's well-being increases with their income. I think that GDP is sort of a proxy variable, or income is a proxy variable for the opportunities that you have. And people with more opportunities end up better off. And it turns out when people have more opportunities to earn higher incomes, on average, people earn higher incomes. And that's why it's so darn correlated. Now I'm going to come back and show you. Actually, the thing I wanted to show you is, look, it's the case that hours of work have gone down. When we get richer, we do consume more leisure. That's been true for a really, really long time. My children do not work, and I do not want them to work. They are 10 and 6 years old. They are not supposed to work. And it turns out that, historically, kids did work. My daughter, when we were in Australia last, decided to buy a book for her classroom, and it was a book about a 6-year-old who was sent to Australia for stealing, and was on her own and working really hard. And it's this totally sad story about this 6-year-old trying to eke out a living, and then she dies of typhoid. And I was like, really? We're bringing this to your school? And Matilda's like, that's history, Mom. So that's history, right? Kids worked at young ages, and now they don't, and that's good. People worked at old ages. They worked until they died, and now they don't, and that is good. So we see hours are coming down. Some of it's coming down through prime age men, and we think that's a problem. But in general, when we actually want to see hours come down, and historically that's what we do when we get richer. So this is the sense also in which GDP is an imperfect proxy, because if we didn't let these hours come down, GDP would be bigger. And that was mentioned earlier, in France, they have less income, but they have more time to sit around in cafes, and they seem to like that. So you can see the French data down here. The German data is unbelievable. They seem to hardly work, very happy. So you can see that there's something else that's going on. So now let's come back, and I'm going to make this defense of GDP by showing you the data, which is if we take life evaluation, which is the subjective measure most studied by economists, it is highly correlated with income and within a country with individual income, and it's highly correlated with GDP across countries. And that high correlation is around 80%. So it's very correlated. And what we see is richer people have greater life satisfaction than poorer people within a country, between countries. Richer countries have people with greater average life satisfaction. And on average, economic development leads to increases in life satisfaction. So here you can see there's a tight fit both between and across countries. The black arrows shows you the relationship between life satisfaction and real GDP per capita within a country. And you can see that relationship looks very similar to what we see across countries, which is what we see in the red line. And it's a really tight relationship. That's a great fit. So what if we want to look at just the United States, because we're focusing here in the US? You can see that the top 10% of the income distribution, very, very few of them report being not too happy. 2% say they're not too happy, compared to 53% who say they're very happy. If we look at the bottom 10% of the income distribution, you get a lot more people in the not too happy category, 26%. So it's just very clear when you look within the United States that the rich are enjoying much higher levels of subjective well-being than the poor. And if you want to see how the U.S. compares to other countries, this is a lowest fit plot of annual household income against the satisfaction ladder. You can see the USA is the line that goes out the farthest because we are the richest. But what you can see are beautiful, beautiful examples of diminishing marginal utility, right? So we keep getting happier as we get additional dollars, but each additional dollar buys us just a little tiny bit less utility. And so a lot of people misinterpreted this as saying money doesn't keep buying us happiness, but that's just because they couldn't see the beautiful, beautiful diminishing marginal utility. So let's help them by taking the log of those lines. And then you can see the beautiful diminishing marginal utility because they don't flatten out anymore. more. And the US looks very similar to these other 25 largest countries with a slope of about 0.35. So we see that there is just this very tight relationship between subjective well-being and income. And then here you can see that graph again. So I think that there's a lot to be said for looking at income. And I have to say, Carol, I'm super confused about actually what it means to look at state GDP and state income, because GDP measures total income, measures everything that's produced. Those things are supposed to be equal. So I think putting them both in a regression is getting at measurement problems with measuring state GDP and state income, because they should equal each other. So we think that this thing is doing a pretty good job, but it's not gonna necessarily do everything. So I want to turn to some of the things it's not going to do. But first, I want to just make a couple more comments on revealed preference, which is just to remember that when we look at these sort of quality of life measures through revealed preference, we're looking at an equilibrium situation, which means that a person on the margin should sort of be indifferent between the traffic they get in San Francisco and the high prices in San Francisco and the wages in San Francisco and moving somewhere else. And so it's the person on the margin isn't having a higher quality of life being there, right? They should be like right at that point where they're indifferent. And then I guess the question is, how many people are on the margin, or is there like, a bunch of people who, have these strong preferences for the amenities and are getting a ton of surplus. But remember, the willingness to pay is a function of both preferences and income. And so those with lower incomes live in lower quality of life areas because quality of life is a normal good and people buy more of it with more income. Now, I think you raised a bunch of good questions about, well, maybe that's not the only thing that's going on. Maybe they're steered into lower quality of life places, or maybe there's informational problems. And so I do think we should ask some questions about whether people know what they're getting into in terms of quality of life. But if you take a look at revealed preference meets subjective well-being, this is life satisfaction by county, and you can see that it doesn't look like the darkest areas with the highest subjective well-being are not the places where we would get the quality of life measures showing us that people are willing to pay a lot for housing, right? You don't see, we don't, people naturally would think of like California as having a lot of these dark areas, but instead we're seeing a lot of them here in the middle. But I think, again, that's just not that surprising if we think that people are optimizing, and what we're seeing is what happens in equilibrium. So I want to come to this idea that it can be hard to disentangle the relationship between well-being and GDP from other measures of living standards, because GDP is so correlated with other things. And so let's take a look at these other things, some of these things that Carol was talking about, and then let's see how much like income is actually a sufficient statistic or not a sufficient statistic. So the OECD recommends 4 categories of questions on subjective well-being. Life evaluation, I've already shown you that. Affect, so that's like sort of how you're experiencing your day. Eudaimonic well-being, and then domain evaluations. So I'm going to really focus on what I call hedonism versus eudaimism. I always mispronounce eudaimism. So psychologists describe 2 distinct concepts of well-being that are revolving around distinct philosophies. So economists have mostly focused on these ideas that well-being consists of pleasure or happiness, and eudaimism is the idea that well-being is the actualization of our human potential. So we can think about whether these things are going to show the same kinds of relationships. So this is life satisfaction 5 years ago, and you can see that it also, and I'm going to show you almost all cross-country data, but I can tell you that the data looks very similar if we were looking within a country, any given country, in particular the US, and you can see that the US sits mostly on the line in a lot of these cases, and I'll point out where it doesn't. So this is life satisfaction 5 years ago, and the correlation looks exactly the same with GDP today as if we were looking at current life satisfaction. So we do see both we see some stickiness, but I think that's because we see some stickiness in the income as well. And now I think this is the measure you were calling optimism, which is what's your expected life satisfaction in 5 years. And you see that there the correlation with current income is a little bit flatter, but still highly robust. So there's a correlation of 0.4, but highly significant. So what now if we turn to positive affect, like enjoyment, happiness, calm, smiling? Well, happiness we see has a pretty strong correlation with GDP per person. You can see the U.S. actually sits a little bit higher above the line, but as countries get richer, as people get richer, they experience more happiness. They also experience a bit more calm. So did you feel calm all day yesterday? We see a tight relationship there as well. Now, again, the correlation coefficient's coming down a little bit, but again, still highly statistically significant. And you can see the relationship. There's some outliers, but it's still pretty clustered around the line. What about, did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? Again, same thing, positive upward correlation. Did you enjoy your day yesterday? Positive upward correlation. So in sum, that's hedonism, or as most people call it, happiness, is strongly related to income across countries and within countries, including the United States. So richer countries have more people who are more satisfied with their life, happier, experience more enjoyment, and are calmer. So that's the good, okay, what else are we going to get from looking at other measures? Because I just showed you everything's pretty much correlated with income. Well, now we're going to turn to see some stuff that looks a little bit different. So we could go to negative affect. So I start with pain because pain is the one where we see a very strong negative relationship. And here, what we see in the regression is that the U.S. actually is exactly on the line and looks exactly where it should be in terms of being a richer country with less pain. So as pain goes down, people, as incomes go up, people tend to experience less pain. And I think this was a point that Alan Kruger originally noted, and I think it has been very informative for us to think about the relationship between income and pain. Depression also goes down with income. Fear goes down with income. And you can think about that as people buying more safety, one of the other issues that was mentioned. Anger, however, does not relate with income. Sadness is unrelated to income. Worry is unrelated to income. Although worrying about money, pretty related to income. Stress is actually upward sloping. More income, more stress. And you see this, the U.S. looks exactly like this. You see this within countries as well as what we see across countries. So many measures of negative affect, anger, sadness, worry, are uncorrelated with GDP per capita. Stress rises as countries get richer, and both depression and fear and pain fall with GDP per capita, but both have clear potential relationships with GDP per capita. So what about, what I call this is, what about how my first grader experiences his day? His actualization of his human potential, meaning, learning, control. And this is where we see that there aren't strong relationships with income. And I think this is actually the place for us to start focusing our energy if we want to think about what are the measures of quality of life that are going to tell us something different besides income. And here, were you proud of something you did yesterday? It's really important to have pride. Psychologists tell us it makes us feel good about ourselves. We want to feel proud of something we did. And there's just no correlation with income. Were you bored? Surprisingly, no correlation with income. Did you feel active and productive? So now we see some relationship with income, and it is positive upward sloping. As people get richer, they are able to feel more active and productive. They're able to like what they do each day a bit more. Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? It's a weaker relationship, but maybe there's something there, but that's not a great p-stat. Were you able to choose how you spent your time all day? Again, not that strongly related. So we have this much clearer relationship between well-being and income across countries when one focuses on the hedonic measure of well-being, a much less clear relationship between well-being and income across countries when you focus on the eudaimonic measures. And is this because these measures do a worse job at capturing a consistent concept across countries or across people? Or is it because the ways to improve these forms of well-being are less related to the resources that one has? And I think those are the kinds of questions we should be asking. So in conclusion, I think that this is sort of a pathetic conclusion, but if you want to know about the disparities across the United States, I think we got to start by just looking at income inequality and seeing what's going on there, because that's actually going to tell us a lot. If we want successful alternative measures, it's useful to look at what is not correlated with income. And I think we should be thinking about whether it's declining work or wage stagnation that's actually causing the divisions. And I'll end by saying there's a really nice piece in the New York Times, I think the magazine this weekend, about a town in Arkansas where the residents really want fewer government services, and they really don't like the government. And it's not federal government over there giving money to immigrants or people who aren't them. They're pissed about the library. And I really I spend a lot of time thinking about this article because the library is a really important part of my life. Again, I have kids, but the library is a nice space. You know, there's computers there, there's a quiet space there. You can leave your kids in the room and they read. And it's a community space. We go for events. It's a really important part of my community. And then I'm reading about this town where I would think if you're lower income, it's got to be even more important to you to have this great resource of a library. And they were outraged at how much was being spent on the library. And this is a place where I just want to, the outrage was over a proposal to pay the librarian who has a master's degree $25 an hour. And they thought that was fancy pants, big city wages, and nobody had the right to earn that on their nickel in their town. And when they said, well, she has a master's degree, they were like, I learned the Dewey Decimal System in 5th grade. Why does she need more than an elementary school education? And so when we're trying to dig into these divisions, I think that they're going to be a lot harder for us to get at, because they have to do with, what people think is their notions of fairness and their notions of responsibility. And I think that's what this article explores, is that seems to be this growing mistrust that is leading people to not want to help each other out. And that not wanting to help each other out includes not wanting to chip in for communal resources. And that's one of the things I'm most concerned about. And I will tell you that I didn't bring any of this data today, but if you want to see the scariest thing about what's going on in the United States, is to look at not the decline in trust in government. That's abysmal. But it's actually the decline in interpersonal trust, that we're not trusting each other. And those declines terrify me. And you see this in this article about Arkansas. If you're not trusting your neighbor, you're not chipping in for the town library. And without the town library, your kids aren't getting the education that they could get. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So we're going to have a little bit of time for discussion. If you want to ask a question, you should put your little tent up like this. And there are 3 folks going around with microphones, so please wait until they come so everybody can hear your question. So, open it up to the floor. Steve?
So I love Betsy's discussion, but I wanted to actually sort of think about a point that Dr. Graham made, which was about whether what we're talking about, and we're talking about all yesterday, is something new or something old. And I think about teaching my economics of poverty course, and I often talk about sort of very flat or increasing childhood poverty while U.S. poverty has fallen. And I go back and I talk about changes that happened starting in the earliest part of the last century with the falling return to physical labor, and through much of the latter half of the last century with falling male labor force participation and falling marriage rates. And I think about the 1970s and 80s when we talked about manufacturing workers who stayed in Flint, Michigan for decades, and really didn't consider taking jobs. And we could talk about union benefits, but these people were just, in many ways, not willing to take a job that paid half of a job they'd previously held. And what we didn't talk about, and I think Dr. or Carol talked about this, sort of pointed to these ideas that this stuff has been happening for a long time. And things are much worse now in terms of male labor force participation and more concentrated. But something that sort of struck me early or throughout yesterday was, is it just a really big shock? Is there something, is the China shock that we talked about last time just much bigger and much worse than anything we've seen before? And a lot of what's going on is sort of these sort of extreme effects that people have, even psychological effects people have from loss, that's very different from the effects we have in gain. And no one's talked about prospect theory over the last day and a half, but I think we really need to think, how much has the decisions people have been making in these poor, deprived places, the anger they're feeling in poor, deprived places, the unwillingness to cooperate in poor, deprived places, being driven by these extreme effects that people feel when they lose a large amount. And when I saw what happened in that picture the other day to loss in manufacturing jobs during a 7 or 8 year period, concentrated in probably what was spatially only about like 20% of the area of the U.S., it's just dramatically striking. And those types of losses can change places and can change a generation. And I just wanted to put that out there as something to think about.
I'm not sure there was quite a question there, but does somebody want to comment?
Yeah, just a comment, and it relates also to something Betsy said at the end. But what's interesting, and in trying to understand the puzzle of why poor minorities are so optimistic compared to poor whites, despite objective circumstances being worse, it's still a story of gradual upward progress. And so most minorities report they live better than their parents did, which is pretty accurate, versus most blue-collar whites report to live worse than their parents did. And worse may be, they may have one more car than their parents did or whatever, but they no longer have these jobs that came not only with, a stable income and some stability, but also with respect. It was sort of the respect and dignity that came from having, and life was kind of the stable family and the stable workplace, and both of those things are gone for a lot of people. Andrew Cherlin at Hopkins, a brilliant sociologist, has done work showing that people who report to live worse than their parents are less likely to trust others, their communities, they're less likely to trust the government, and they have much lower levels of life satisfaction. So I think you're right. I think it's a loss aversion story, but it's a loss aversion story. It is about losing income and status, but I think it's also about kind of losing a whole way of life that has as much to do, in my view, as technology-driven growth as it has to do with China. But yeah, the same jobs are just not coming back. And there is a lot of literature showing that, as you mentioned, that with loss aversion, people often can get more extreme in their views.
Can I just add something to that? I don't know. Does that not work?
I don't think you have to turn it on.
Oh, okay. This idea that people aren't doing as well as their parents, that's right. But it's really about growth, right? Growth slowdown means that we're not growing fast enough for people to be doing a lot better than their parents. So you go to that Raj Chetty data where it shows 90% of people had higher incomes than their parents. That's not because they obviously couldn't change their place in the distribution. So that's because we were growing so fast that you could even slip behind your parents in the distribution, but you didn't see it because we had that growth. And I do think that we should think a lot more about, so you put it on loss. I think a lot about how important a progress narrative is for people's lives. And I don't know how we start to try to quantify that, but I think most people get up in their day and they're like aiming for something, right? And they're, even if it's, I'm saving because we're going on this fancy vacation, or I'm trying to achieve this thing, or I'm trying to get this promotion. And that seems to be the biggest loss, is there's no like narrative of progress. Like we are working towards this thing, and then things will be better. And I worry that and then we see there's no progress because they don't actually their kids don't end up better off than them. And so I wonder if it's not the slipping behind loss, but the loss of a progress narrative.
Don?
Great session. Tying together well-being, sort of inequality in space, and revealed preference is one of the things that's in there. But also one of the key concepts. I don't know if it's the most mentioned concept in the course of the conference, but pretty high on the list is mobility. We had a whole session on it, mobility declining. And if there is one thing that I will sort of, without success, hope that people take away from this conference, is that they stop using the term mobility, which I think sort of puts together too many things. And in particular, I think that what we're observing movement. We can see when people move or they don't move, the rate of moving has declined or it's increased. But when you put together mobility, it seems to suggest that somehow the costs of mobility have gone up, and maybe the costs of mobility, or of moving, have gone up, but maybe the incentives for moving have changed somehow. And this sort of inability or unwillingness so far as I can see, to unpack these things, to ask, why are people not moving? Now, if it turns out that somehow the costs of moving have risen dramatically, Greyhound bus tickets used to be cheap and now they're expensive, or you just needed the rent, you didn't need first, last, and security. Thinking concretely about what are those barriers to movement, I think, is very important. Now, if it's just that the coastal cities used to be very inviting because they had cheap housing, that's not really a sort of a failure, either of revealed preference or of mobility. They can be perfectly mobile, they just don't want to move. And so I think digging in to try and understand what are, again, on some deeper level, what are the reasons that people aren't moving? And if it's that they're staying in a place because they have this incredible family network, do you really want them to move? So in any case, I think that you have to diagnose why these changes are happening in more detail to understand what the remedy is.
So I absolutely agree. So at the end of my exciting paper, I talk about Southwest Airlines and forming portfolios. In Sherwin Rosen's original, you move to Dallas and you're stuck in Dallas. Southwest allows you to form a linear combination, spending a week in New York City or San Francisco. So you get into questions of how you form combinations of cities' attributes from where you visit. And so I think the quality of life literature, from my perspective, since we didn't have daily data on where you spent your time, there's work in China right now. There's a new paper that when it's very polluted in Beijing, people take more bullet train trips to clean cities outside of Beijing. So no one's finding what I'm saying interesting. But this is how you form a linear combination and protect yourself when you face high disadvantages. So I would say that our strategy set is actually increasing. Walter Oy said that with air conditioning, we can now offset much of the South's humidity in a household production framework. And so new technologies, air conditioning, transport, Southwest, actually increases our menu. So you can see somebody living in a, quote, low quality of life area, but whose quality of life is actually rising because they have a greater menu to tap into.
Dan?
Dan Sickle from Wellesley College. So I have a comment, not a question. There was this interesting conversation that kind of prompted part of Betsy and Matt's talk about is GDP a sufficient statistic. So I just wanted to highlight for people an effort that is underway at the Bureau of Economic Analysis to consider whether to create some supplemental measures to GDP that would be supplemental measures that might more get at social welfare. So, for example, folding in income inequality and thinking about how might one combine GDP with a measure of income inequality to get a broader measure of social welfare, and perhaps also other factors like mortality, leisure, and so on. So just wanted to flag for everyone that effort's underway, and if you're interested, there's going to be a session at the AEA meetings in San Diego where BEA will be talking more about that along with a panel of people commenting on some of their plans. Just wanted to put that out there for everyone. Thanks.
Let me take another one over here.
I work as a journalist, and a lot of political journalism for the last several years has consisted of our editors sending us out into America to ask people questions and hearing people repeat back to us things they've heard us say on national television. And so I was thinking of Carol's data about white male dissatisfaction, and the University of Michigan surveys showed wild disparities between Republicans and Democrats in economic optimism. And they're growing, particularly since the last election. So the thing that I'm wondering is there any actual way, other than anecdote, to control for the information environment that somebody is in and how that affects their optimism and how that affects their economic choices?
I wish we had a control for which kind of news people watched. I can imagine, though, I mean, I haven't tried to do this, that you could get some sort of data at the county level of which are the media types that are most prevalent, and I think that would tell you a lot. It's a good idea.
But I do think that like economic optimism, people do seem to respond to that question as if they're cheerleading for their political team. So, Republicans now are very optimistic, Democrats not so. If things switch in the next election, so will that, I'm sure. But a measure of optimism, like what do you expect your life satisfaction to be in 5 years, isn't going to be moved in the same way, because it's asking you to think internally about you and not prompting you to think about the economy writ large.
So I'm just going to take a moment to ask the last question, and then we have a break. So I want to come back and ask back to the panel the question Matt posed, which is, where do we want the poor to live? As we sort of look at this, I saw I caught the side eye on public housing, which has just a terrible reputation, although I would say a lot of heterogeneity in that, and at least some of the work I'm doing suggests it's good for kids compared to their alternatives, where they would live if they didn't live in public housing. But if you don't like public housing, given what we see, if we have a strategy, where do we want people to live? Where are we going to put the poor?
So since I know that I don't know the answer to that, I'd want to use mechanism design techniques. So just as Al Roth has taught us how we match power couple doctors with residencies, I again would want to turn to mechanism design for the poor to rank areas where they want to live, and then for communities to state their willingness to take these individuals, and for there to be side payments to these communities. And so this, I think in this age, so Esther Duflo gave that the lecture of economist as plumber. I want us to be some urban plumbers here to use such mechanisms and to use revealed preference methods there. I know that I don't know the answer.
I don't really know the answer either. I think there are a lot of lessons, though, in some stuff I've been looking at in terms of community efforts to deal with things like the opioid crisis, but the ones that are successful tend to deal with opioids, obesity, poverty, all at the same time. And they require kind of public-private partnerships and local level leadership. And one of the things that they tend to do that isn't very expensive is engage people, whether it's in volunteering or community activities. And it seems simple, almost stupidly simple. But if you're thinking about bringing communities together, and it's like the data on migrants. Most people that are anti-immigration don't know a migrant. And people that know migrants are much more likely to be pro-immigration. So it's like, if you don't know a poor person, you don't want them living near you. So that's not a great answer to your question, but it is worth noting that there are some quite an increasing number of deprived communities in the U.S., both kind of rural, that kind of deprived communities, but also these things work in urban areas that have been able to turn around a bit due to these kind of simple interventions that are designed to bring communities together. Often they're designed to increase well-being, but I think they help address some of these issues of isolating, the poor being isolated from the rest.
So,
Can I?
oh,
actually,
yes,
I'm
you will
just
have the
gonna-
last word.
I was gonna. I think just one thing to think about with that question is that people want to stay close to their family. As they grow up, they want to be near their parents who can help them with childcare. So they want to be close intergenerationally, physically in space. If we're going to have mobility, then we actually have to have mixed communities, because if lower income people are living separate from higher income people, then a lower income person who becomes a higher income person is then sort of by definition separated from the people that they love, and we don't want that. People don't want that. And so I think you have to figure out how you're going to mix people in space if we're also going to have people being able to, take advantage of the land of opportunity and move up the ladder.
So that is going to be the end of this session. Let's thank our speakers. Go get coffee. You have a little bit of time. Our next session starts at 11 o'clock. We have saved the best for last, and obviously the best audience and the best speakers, the most important topics. So our first speaker is Gilles Durante.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let me start with a pet peeve of mine. Somebody will took issue yesterday with the first part of the title. I will take issue with the second part of the title, as the time for place-based policies finally arrived. And I'm like we've never done it. So somebody said that the transfers, I think it was at Glazer or Paul Krugman, that the transfers in some parts of the country represented up to 20% of local GDP. Let me give you another number. What we spend on place-based policies, according to Pat Klein and Enrico Moretti, is about 3 times what we spend on unemployment insurance in normal times, not in particularly good times, like now when employment is very low, nor in particularly bad times, but 3 times UI. So it's actually very, very large. Let me give you, so I'm an urban economist and I'm here to help, but I'm not here to bring good news. So I'm going to be very pessimistic about what place-based policies can achieve, but I'm not against that. I mean, I'm going to conclude that we'll probably need to do more, but we'll need to do more because that's an uphill battle. We have strong headwinds in many, many places, and unfortunately, we'll probably need to do stuff at the same time. That may not improve things very much, but perhaps prevent them from getting much worse. So I'll give you first some narratives. I mean, I've been sitting here since yesterday morning and try to give you my own narrative about where I think we are and why we are there. And then go into some mechanics and try to bring a lot of stuff that's been said in the last 2 days. So you all know that, I think, the richest cities in America by wages circa 1950 were called Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Trenton. You know, the world, Trenton makes and the world takes, right? So that was true at the time. Providence, Rhode Island, and so on and so forth. So the mighty have really fallen. What is less well known about those places is that those very prosperous cities were specialized in key manufacturing sectors and were vertically integrated, doing everything from the conception of products to running the show, exporting, selling, and so on and so forth, producing, etc., etc. So vertically integrated, I think, is really important. So then in my narrative, there's a first wave of shocks from about 1950 to about 1980, where changes in telecommunication, transportations, firm management, all made it possible to operate things from a distance. For instance, something like the carbon copy allowed people to actually work across 7 floors and then several sites, and you could actually send written instructions without having to type them over and over again. So all of that actually allowed the separation of the stuff that we can call like direct production, like blue-collar workers, assembly, like production, and stuff that is usually non-production, but is still productive, but that we may call whatever management, which is about headquarters, business services around those headquarters, innovation, and all those things. Which in turn has led, and this is something that we did with Diego Puga many years ago, which has led to this bifurcation into management cities and production cities. So between 1950 and 1980 plus, we moved from a world that was about specialization by sectors, and you were city X and you were working in sector 12, and you were with city Y and you were working in sector 25, and so on and so forth, to a world where you had management type cities doing white-collar, well-type activities, and a world where you also had blue-collar, well-type cities, which had lost their white-collar type employment. At the beginning of that shock, everybody suffered. Everybody suffered. Those that were bound to be, or those that were to become white-collar places, as well as those that were to become blue-collar places. The crisis in New York for many, many years New York was an industrial powerhouse. 30+% of its employment was in manufacturing. We are now down to less than 1%. And during the heydays of that transformation, it was a lot of pain. It was a huge amount of pain for the New Yorks, for the LAs, well of the world, as well as for the Trentons and the Pittsburghs. But eventually, those places that went into management and innovation, they gained and they expanded, with the argument that maybe in the background, actually, the agglomeration effect for those activities may be stronger, and those activities actually expanded because this may be also where the country had a comparative advantage. The cities left with production, they lost. So in the best case, they went from Pittsburgh, whatever, 3 million, and shrinking and stabilizing, and then, yes, they were sort of okay. With the problem that those weaker agglomeration effects led to smaller cities, but also weaker cities. Those activities could then be relocated at some point to the south. And then there was a second wave of shocks, which was because since yesterday we've talked a lot about 1980 to today. That's why I decided actually we need to understand the full story. We need to go a little bit further in time. And so the second wave of shocks, that it's been about two things. So yesterday we talked a lot about China and international trade. But before China, there was a Japan shock. There was a Southeast Asia shock. Yeah, China was much bigger and was pretty bad for many places. But also along with international trade, there was technology. And at some level, this is how some really good stuff can be really bad news. We've become incredibly good at producing goods, at assembling them, at doing stuff, and these are normal goods. These are not luxury goods. So as we get richer, the demand for those goods is not increasing very fast, and that's. So that means that something will have to give, and it's employment in those sectors that had to give. On the other hand, the management and innovation cities, the gains from globalization clearly went to them. Then you had two different groups here. You have those that decide, okay, we'll take on more people. So we're talking about cities in the interior west and in the south. So Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston, and Dallas, places like that, expanding greatly in population. Winner cities on the coasts, they decided that it was good as it is, and they basically shut down entry, and property prices went up, which means that we've also had this divergence in terms of education, where these places have become ever more educated because these are only the most educated, the most affluent that can actually afford the cities. This is not the only story. I think there are at least 3 other things that come on top. The first one, particularly relevant for the rural world, is in a world where 5% of the country is employed at doing agriculture, you can sustain a network of very small cities that will provide basic services for those places. So those basic services are going to be what? They're going to be things like, a local doctor, basic retail, and all those things. And then around those really small places, there will be bigger places where you will have whatever, the banks and the lawyers, and slightly more sophisticated retail and restaurants and all of that. This is coming from central place theory. As I told you, I'm an urban economist. The thing is, when agricultural unemployment falls really low to 1% or less, it's not quite clear that this system is viable anymore. And we may be living in a world where this system may just be collapsing because the agricultural base is becoming too thin. We're moving towards a world where we'll be left with 12 farms in this country, and those farms will be covering several states each. So that's clearly part of the rural wars as well. Again, what do we do with that? I'll come back to this. Also, many cities used to have an anchor tenant industry. So that's a paper I wrote in the EAR many years ago, where, even if you lose a lot, you'll still be left with this anchor industry. So typically, something associated with natural resources in many places, or thinking about Rochester, like the photographic industry that formed the base where Rochester for many years. So sometimes they got lucky and they got more out of that, like the reprographic industry with Xerox and so on and so forth. So things could go up and down, but there was always this anchor tenant industry. In many cases, those anchor tenant industries just disappeared. We're talking about all the mining stuff. We're talking about those huge plants in southern states doing textile, doing doing well tobacco and so on and so forth, they all disappeared, they all got completely wiped out, and nothing to replace them, which means that there was nothing to grow from, which I think is part of the problem as well. And the other thing is, we live in a world where I think cities want to become larger with time. And there's progress in transportation. We're able to cram more people within central areas and so on and so forth. And in a world where there's strong demographics, a lot of immigration, yes, those cities can grow, whatever the Phoenix and Las Vegas of the world can grow, but rural population is not declining. But when we turn to a world with very weak demographics and no immigration, if those cities, if Phoenix and Las Vegas and the others still want to grow, something will have to give. I mean, it's simple math, but it's simple, adding on, constrained. So I think there's also something to that story. So let me move to the second part of my talk and actually try to bring that together in a slightly more formally. So this is a graph that you probably know from Blanchard and Katz. So this is my own version of the Blanchard and Katz graph. So you have a labor demand at period T, labor supply, short run, that's vertical, the population that's here wants to work, and you have this population, and then you have a negative shock. Is the labor demand curves move to the left, and for some reason in Blanchard and Katz they think about that shock as a big decline in wages, which is really bizarre because that's not consistent with what they do well after. So here I'm putting that. So initially it's unemployment. Then what's happening over time is people will move out, so the labor supply curve, the short-term labor supply curve will be moving to the left more or less fast, depending on mobility. And in terms of labor demand, what's happening is wages slowly adjust downwards. And as wages are adjusting downwards, what you have is local entrepreneurs then saying, okay, it may be worth creating new firms. You have firms from outside that may say, okay, this location has become more competitive, more attractive. So you also have the labor demand that moves to the right. And the big question that Blanchard and Katz is asking is which of those two adjustment mechanisms with, and at what sort of pace. So then the way it works is eventually, after 5 to 10 years, you have the labor supply curve that has moved quite a lot. There's a lot of mobility, and the labor demand curve that has bounced back. So given that those graphs can get pretty quickly very complicated, let me just show the long term of that. So the long term is you have this labor demand shock that pushes the labor demand curve very far to the left, and then it bounces back. But at the same time, the labor supply curve, in the long run, is pretty flat. So a lot of the adjustment is through mobility, and the process is reasonably quick and not too painful. So in terms of implications of that for that sort of world for place-based policies, you may still want to do a little bit of stuff. Welfare transfers in places that have bigger shocks are probably in order. The big issue here is that if you do welfare transfers, you also want to make sure that the transition is still happening at a good pace, and that by doing welfare transfers, you're not slowing down the transition. And you may also want to do place-based policies in terms of both on the supply side, like retooling workers, local capacity building for entrepreneurs and that sort of stuff, and attracting firms from outside so that the labor demand curve will bounces back quickly. So that's, this is a pretty benign world, but that was a world that was probably quite specific from those shocks across the board that we've seen from 1950 to 1980 and this benign period in the 1980s. Then the second wave of shocks, I think that works pretty differently for reasons that should become hopefully clear very soon. So we've had this labor demand curve that has moved first. If you were in the heartland, you had this first wave of shocks from 1950 to 1980, and then you have a second wave of negative shocks. But the response in that case has been different, in part because in part because the labor supply curve is actually pretty different. So here what I'm showing is I'm actually starting to distinguish between population and labor, because I think we need to do that. And actually population is pretty immobile. I have two stories for that. The first one is maybe everybody who had reasonable opportunities elsewhere, well educated, has moved out, and that's something. So those who are left are probably those who are either very attached or very low well opportunities well elsewhere. And the other thing that is, as people move out, the cost of living well locally is becoming really, really cheap. You know, the cost of housing is collapsing, and you can basically have a house for essentially free, which means that that's giving you strong incentives not to move and actually to stay. At the same time, you may not be particularly well attached to the labor force, especially if wages need to go way down for you to be well employable. So you have this bifurcation between employment and population, and creating some permanent unemployment. Okay, so it means that the mobility mechanism has sort of disappeared. At the same time, the bouncing back of labor demand is probably much weaker than before. First, because everybody is sort of looking for firms from outside to come in, so there's a lot of competition for that. And the other one is because everybody who's moved was more skilled, more educated, more entrepreneurial. Those who are left are probably less so. So in that world, the case for place-based policies seems much stronger, because we're talking about periods of misery that are going to be, arguably much longer, so calling for probably more welfare transfers. A big issue here is that you don't want those welfare transfers to percolate across generations, which means that we need to think really long and really hard about how to do it better and how to target that better. Then I told you I was an urban economist, and I had some further bad news. The further bad news is that it's not quite clear that the labor demand curve is going to bounce back. There's a case to be made that the labor demand curves can actually keep moving to the left. This has to do with a major feature of urban economies, which is agglomeration effects. So if you start with a sector that employs 10,000 people, it's vibrant, it's working well, you have a big critical mass, you're internationally competitive. And then you're being hit by a series of shocks, like competition from elsewhere in the world, a lower demand for your products, and things are moving down, and you're left with whatever, 8,000 people. 8,000 you can still manage, you're still fine, but then you move down to like 6,000, and at 6,000 you started losing key suppliers, key input-output linkages, and so on and so forth, which means that maybe some other firms will start exiting as well, and you may go into a death spiral. So that's the bad news, is not only we've had those two shocks, but those two shocks that may not be the end of it, because many of those places may no longer be sustainable. Sorry, I'm moving in the wrong direction. So here we're living in a world where, yes, there's a case for place-based policies that seem really strong, because there's a lot of miseries, there's a lot of stuff that does not work, but this is really going to be an uphill battle, because we've had a series for many of those places of negative shocks, and maybe actually it's no longer viable, it's no longer sustainable. So it's going to be a long, painful transitions. Again, transfers will alleviate the pain, but you don't want transfers to slow down the transition too much. I'm from Europe. I've seen that in Europe, where we went into that direction really big time from the 1970s, and many of those places are stuck into there. Because my time is running out, so I don't believe in any of the usual solution. Hopefully I know a lot about infrastructure, and I don't think this is going to save those places. Potentially the opposite. You know, a road allows stuff to come in, but also allows people to move out. New clusters of economic activity, I think the record of that is actually extremely poor. That's industrial policy with a special twist, but I don't think it has worked historically. University research, yes, this is great, but it's only so many places perhaps that can do that. There's lots of interventions that we need to think maybe a lot more about, is how to reorganize those places now that they've lost so much population, so that they don't look like Detroit, where as as human well density goes very low, well, the cost of serving these people gets really, really high. So we need to think about that. So yes, I don't have any great hope that we'll be able to turn those places around. Well, nonetheless, I strongly believe that whenever there's a lot of misery, we should try to alleviate that, be it only through pure transfers. But as somebody raised this morning, there's an issue of actually people seem to be refusing the handout. Part of the last election where people standing out saying, I don't want a handout. So it's before even doing any welfare, it's actually about making welfare acceptable. And I'm not a sociologist. I was not born in this country, so I just don't know how you do that. I think it's about, yeah, you can hear that I wasn't born in South Philly, right? It's about, I think, labor supply, interventions. We always talk about education, and we talked about education quite a lot yesterday. I think it should go beyond education. There's a lot on the labor market that goes beyond education, which is about showing up on time and so on and so forth. Be obedient, be persistent, be gritty. So one of my colleagues at Penn is really big on that. That's Angela Duckworth. So I think there's a lot of those things that we need to think about as well, over and beyond education. Mobility, I think there's a big trade-off. I'm a big fan of mobility, but I understand we'll never get everybody to move. So the last ones will probably be in an even worse situation. What do we do about that? So there are clear trade-offs about mobility. And I also think that all those places that do really, really well should be willing to accept more people. The zone has become completely unaffordable, and at some level this is not normal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is David Newmark.
Thanks. I thought I was at the wrong conference until Matt started talking about urban poverty, because I'm talking about urban poverty and place-based policies at a much more local level. So this has all been very interesting. These are not issues I've thought about a lot. But it's important to point out the obvious, which is that the disparities within urban areas are incredibly dramatic. And I think, I don't know how much is more so or less so, it depends how you slice the data. But obviously this is a real issue. There's probably a little less reason for pessimism, at least not as much pessimism as Gilles, but because at least in urban areas, the neighborhoods we're worrying about are near neighborhoods where jobs are being created, right? So it's not so much it's not a geographic isolation problem, and it potentially the same way. So I'm going to talk about enterprise zones, and I don't have the exact title of the conference, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about why I think the evidence we have so far is pretty convincing that these haven't worked, and then I'm going to talk about a Hamilton project I did, where when you're dreaming up policy, you never know if it's going to work. Obviously, you're making a policy proposal, but trying as much as possible to root an enterprise zone-like policies in what we've learned about what doesn't work, to think about whether we can design them better. So let me just start with some. So now we've had all these facts about urban-rural. Let me just start with some of the urban facts, indicating why we, at least prima facie evidence, need place-based policy unless we really decide they won't work. U.S. cities continue to have very large concentrations of people in extremely poor areas. People tend to define that as more than 40% poor. And then there's this concept of concentrated poverty, which is a measure of the share of the poor that live in tracts with extreme poverty. And about 13% of the poor in the U.S. are concentrated in only 4,000 extremely poor census tracts. So kind of this remarkable concentration of poverty. Urban poverty has fallen somewhat. Concentrated poverty in urban areas has risen. So obviously this has something to do, of course, with segregation by income and race, which are highly correlated. And concentrated poverty is much higher in urban areas. There are problems of joblessness. When you look at these extreme poverty tracts, I suppose like when you look at the rural tracts, or counties, the prime age male employment rate is a lot lower. Mobility is of the less skilled is lower, although again at the sort of the level of the city as opposed to states or interstate mobility, that may be less of an issue. There are challenges, and I think I don't know if the evidence is great on these challenges, but it's at least plausible. that there are things that inhibit job creation in poor neighborhoods: low skills of workers, declining infrastructure, crime, and the like. And these are potentially things that we can do something about. Repairing infrastructure at a very local level in a city is a much cheaper proposition than building high-speed trains across the country, which may not have as much of an impact. And I would argue that there's always these in urban economics, these efficiency stories about why do place-based policies make sense? Is there agglomeration? Is there a nonlinearity in agglomeration we can exploit? And even if all that's true, do we have any idea what or where it is? I think there's a somewhat simpler argument, and this, I think most people of my generation can see this from having observed the change in not all American cities, but many American cities. There's tremendous positive externalities and welfare gains from urban areas improving that extend well beyond how the poor may benefit from job creation policies. I mean, the vibrancy of American cities is something that so many of us consume, and it's probably something I would not have predicted 20 or 30 years ago when I was living in West Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C. in the mid and late 1980s. I thought we were on a downward spiral. Just a little bit of a depiction of where this concentrated poverty is. This is the geographic concentration of concentrated poverty in the top 100 metro areas. So again, this is not so much focused on rural areas, obviously. And there's no surprise here. The darker places are places of concentrated poverty. There's a few surprising areas, which may have something to do with different populations. Some are urban cores, some are not so clearly urban cores. Some of these I haven't dug into the data. May have in a few of the southwestern places to do more with Indian reservations than other areas, which I'm not really focusing on. So let me turn to the next part. Why not enterprise zones? We've done these for a long time. We've done them at the state level. We've had innovations at the federal level. We now have opportunity zones, which I won't talk about unless it comes up. I don't know that much about them. Nobody does really. Why not? So why not take this thing we've invented and go further? Well, there's weak evidence of job creation, and I'm going to flesh this out in a few minutes. There's weak evidence of poverty reduction. There's evidence that effects may accrue to the more advantaged. Now, I don't reject all urban anti-poverty policies because they create some gentrification, because obviously it's unavoidable. But if all or most of the effects are accruing to the most advantaged, you have a problem. And some evidence that there's negative spillovers. So at best, we get reallocation of jobs. And again, depending on the distributional effects of that and the spillover effects onto others, like the urban externalities I talked about, moving jobs around could turn out to be a good thing. But obviously, if we create more jobs on net, it would be a better thing. In the UK, they had an early enterprise zone program, I think in the 70s, and there was clear evidence it was just reallocating, and the government sort of quickly shut it down for that reason. Again, that may have been wrong, but so it is. So let me talk a little bit. This is just some summary tables of recent enterprise zone evidence. I'm leaving out the evidence on spillovers just because I have limited time. So the top chart is a few somewhat recent studies on employment effects. None of them find any evidence of that's employment levels or employment growth. No evidence of positive effects. Employment rate, again, no evidence of positive effects. The estimate's point negative. The bottom panel is effects on the poverty rate. No clear and compelling evidence, even when you have these negatives, which is good for poverty. They're not significant, so no clear evidence that poverty falls. There are some exceptions, which I think hopefully will show up here. There's the Busso et al. Paper in the AER, 2013, on federal enterprise zones, who find pretty massive job creation effects over a fairly short window. I'm going to talk about this. I'll talk about that now. I forgot which order my slides were in. Let me talk about those results a little bit. First of all, federal enterprise zones simply could be different from a lot of what we've done in the past. We had a lot of state programs. And then we've had different kinds of federal programs, including at the same time as the federal enterprise zones, the federal enterprise communities. They were distinguished by they had aggressive hiring credits and kind of all the usual things you might say, but also very large block grants for what were pretty small areas of about $100 million for business assistance, infrastructure investment, training programs, and the like. It's hard to get rigorous evidence. There just weren't many of them. But non-rigorous evidence, and Busso et al. Admit this when they discuss this in their paper, suggests that this other spending may have helped attract outside private capital. So that's sort of the good case for federal enterprise zones actually were successful and were different from what we've done in the past. On the more negative side, Reynolds and Rowland show that there really aren't distributional benefits. There's no detectable effect on poverty, a slight increase in extreme poverty, again below 40%, above 40%. Main increase in population is the share earning over $100,000. And the positive effects when they were present were in the lower poverty track. So again, that's not a condemnation of federal enterprise zones. Maybe they were successful. Without more of them, we can't really know. But they weren't. I don't think they were wildly successful based on the Reynolds and Rowland results, but maybe a little promising. And then let me go back to the these ones at the bottom here. This is from work by John Hamm and others on state, federal, and state enterprise zones, and then the two different kinds of federal programs. Found, especially with the federal programs, massive reductions in poverty. I just want to really quickly. I've been working on this for a while. This is work coming out in RSUE, and it turns out, and we didn't really expect this until we dug into the data, partly prompted by Steve Ross, who was the editor of this paper. There's pretty amazing negative selection on pre-trends in enterprise zone designation, which actually, when you look at the process for what the application process and criteria are, is not at all surprising. This is a chart. I won't discuss it in detail, but you can go look at it later if you want. If you match on sort of nearby areas, and that's a very common research design, sort of close controls, if you follow my minimum wage wars or woes, depending on your perspective, there's a lot of this close controls must be better. Well, not always true. And here it turns out it's really not true. Busso et al. Used rejected in future zones. The idea is, if you sort of applied but didn't get it, you were more like the places that applied that did get it. Those look like better controls, but still not very good. When you do kind of propensity score matching, which you could sort of think of like a poor man's synthetic control, but let the data tell you what the good controls are, you get very different effects. I won't walk through these tables, but the bottom line is almost all of those beneficial effects of enterprise zones go away. So I still come out with a pretty negative judgment of what the evidence says about the efficacy of enterprise zones. Possible exception of federal enterprise zone type programs with hiring credits and very large amounts of spending. I'll come back later to talk about sort of very crude cost per job estimates. But what should we do? I would say in general, not enterprise zone business as usual, not the way to go. Hard to make the case they've been effective. I was approached by the people at Brookings to say we'd like somebody who's pretty negative enterprise zones to think about whether there's anything they could dream up that might be a sensible urban place-based policy. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what we've learned, what doesn't work, and then speculating about what might work, and drawing on literature on spatial mismatch, on what Judy Hellerstein and I have called racial mismatch, on what we've learned about network hiring to try to think about potentially better policy. I'm going to skip the why not other policies. We can come back to that later. So I developed this proposal called Rebuilding Communities Job Subsidies. It's basically, and it has flavors of other things we do, and in that sense you may just look at it and say it sounds like more of the same, but bear me out because I think it's a bit different. So starting with fully subsidized jobs, and some of these numbers are just sort of pulled out of the air, frankly, 18 months, but jobs that have the potential to build skills that are valuable in the private sector. We all keep hearing the story, there are sort of lower middle skill jobs, electricians and plumbers and various healthcare jobs that don't necessarily require a nursing degree or higher, where people can make at least way more than they make in minimum wage jobs, although I guess if we raise the minimum wage enough, that will no longer be true. So focused on that, as opposed to enterprise zones which just subsidize hiring, and typically the steepest subsidies are for the lowest paying jobs. That may make sense. Also subsidizing jobs that help revitalize and improve disadvantaged urban areas, jobs that actually try to address some of the problems. Whether it's these public safety zones, whether it's healthcare workers, home healthcare workers, or healthcare workers and community healthcare workers in some other setting, whether it's teachers' aides in schools, whether it's urban demolition in places where we've got to kind of convert some places to green space as opposed to abandoned housing, and the final element of that is jobs that are proposals and jobs that are created in cooperation with nonprofits, and community groups. We talked a lot about this with the people at Brookings. People who are on the ground locally, maybe partnered with national nonprofits because they have a lot more experience and a lot more tools, but who kind of know what the problem is in the community. So when you say we're going to only subsidize jobs, if they're going to address some of the barriers to both work and job, work, so on the worker side and job creation on the firm side in these areas, you have at least a better chance of addressing some of the right problems. And then there's a transition into private sector jobs with a continuation of subsidies for another 18 months. And I build in all these ways to kind of incentivize job retention, right? So you're only going to remain eligible for these subsidies if you have a good retention rate of the workers you hire through these subsidies. Targeting on low-income families, but not necessarily non-working families. Restricted initially to economically disadvantaged urban areas, kind of at a sort of a small scale. Although not restricting workers from moving once they take these jobs, because that would seem like a bad idea. And then there's a build-in for sort of an experimental period, design and evaluation. It's actually kind of, Cory Booker has actually talked about some things like this, which I'll come back to later. So what are the rationales? Well, skills related to good jobs makes a lot of sense if you can do it. It's a big caveat. So avoid the bias towards low-wage, high-turnover jobs and traditional enterprise-owned programs. Addressing the disadvantages of some of these urban areas obviously makes sense if you can. And I think targeting residents is very important. A lot of enterprise-owned programs, I know the California program, which they killed, I would say thankfully, because they actually seem to have created a better program, didn't target residents in any real effective sense, and certainly didn't target low-income people. We know from all kinds of evidence on network hiring that if you don't target local residents, you may not create jobs for local residents. If you target local residents, of course, the direct effect is you will by construction, and if there's network connections to those people, then there may be spillovers to other local residents. So that seems worth really emphasizing. I talked about that. The two-phase structure of the subsidies I think is important. I think we learned that hiring credits, get a negative rap in some sense, and I think in many cases that's because they have been somewhat ineffective. But I think we've learned some things we can do better. We've learned how to reduce churning. We can these retention goals sort of put in what are effectively clawbacks to kind of make sure people aren't just taking the subsidies and not really creating other jobs. I think in this case, because you're creating higher skill jobs and you're creating jobs that address some of the particular problems of urban areas, you're less likely to create pure windfalls, paying credits for just maybe crappy retail jobs that might have been created in the urban area anyway, so you're probably going to get fewer windfalls. We learned during the period after the Great Recession that if you offer very high subsidies and the institutional support, you can actually ramp up take-up of hiring credits very quickly. Some of the TANF emergency funds were used for that, and they created hundreds of thousands of jobs pretty quickly. I wouldn't say there's rigorous evidence on post-program effects, but in the paper I discuss some evidence that suggests actually there were some positive post-program effects. There's an urban focus of this. It needn't focus only on urban areas. Since 2016, you can't talk about poverty only in urban areas, certainly in DC. So there may be rural areas that qualify. I'm less optimistic this would be a helpful thing to do, again, because of the lack of connection to other places. But in principle, it could. And I think, again, I think the other big advantages in the urban areas, the positive externalities for others, are more compelling. Is it politically feasible? Is there any appeal? Well, I kind of contrast it with, I actually was on a panel at Brookings with somebody who was advocating very aggressively for what I believe was a $700 billion guaranteed jobs program, which I think is not politically feasible. I also don't think it's a good idea. But this has a flavor of trying to create jobs, but in a much more targeted, much more strategic way that may actually generate benefits, whereas I think the larger scale proposals for guaranteed wage floors, I think the primary motivation is sort of just to create a job of last resort that pays above a certain level to try to force up market wages, which seems like an extraordinarily expensive way to do that. I think political feasibility here is much higher also because you can get more support for private sector job creation for sure, and there's limits to these subsidies, right? They run for a certain period, or not. Guaranteed jobs program sounds like forever. I think that's the flavor of the program. Let me just talk. Why might it work? Why should we be at all more optimistic about this than other enterprise-owned type policies? one of the main criticisms of hiring credits is they create a lot of stigma. When rules for selection or eligibility are based on kind of past individual characteristics, in a sense, they're going to be based on past failures, past difficulties, which is, of course, what creates stigma. By doing the program based on location as opposed to so much individual characteristics, I think there's less worry of that. Just like I have evidence that shows hiring credits during the Great Recession were quite effective. And I think it's a similar idea. If you're looking for a job after the Great Recession, it wasn't that much of a negative signal about you. And I think the same idea is, you happen to be in a poor neighborhood, much less of a negative signal about you than you just got out of jail or something like that. There may be a parallel between depressed periods and depressed areas. And the final thing is, in the paper, we have this long appendix with very small font, but if you're really interested, you can plow through it. We talk about there are past programs that have been done that have flavors of this. There's some New York sort of parks programs where they try to improve neighborhoods and actually don't just have you picking up the garbage, but teach you forestry skills. No evaluation of that one. New Hope, which had quite rigorous evaluation, had shared some flavors of this program, and seems to have been remarkably effective, in fact. So I hold out some hope that this could work. I have built into this proposal kind of an experimental evaluation mode to really figure out if it does work, which I think from all the research on enterprise zones and what we are going to see in the future on opportunity zones and all that, I think we can appreciate the value if we're starting from ground zero with a policy of actually building in a mechanism so we can actually evaluate the policy by making selection exogenous rather than endogenous. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, our discussant, Larry Summers.
I'll speak from here, and since I don't have nuance, I won't have slides. I think there are three broad propositions that the scholarly work in this area sort of establishes. First, there's widely uneven incidence of distress. And in the United States today, there are a set of places in which socioeconomic distress, measured by lack of employment, measured by lack of opportunity for kids, measured by disappointing poverty, measured by poor health status, is substantially concentrated. And that is, I think, an unarguable fact. You could nuance around about the extent to which you should think about this as a within-city phenomenon, or you should think about this as being about areas that it takes hours to drive between. Clearly, there's some significant amount of both. It's useful to refine knowledge about the precise locations and the precise nature of the problem, but I think it's a clear fact. Second, natural economic forces are doing little, if anything, to cause this problem to solve itself through the natural workings of market mechanisms, even on a stochastic basis. That is, not only is there not convergence of a form that reduces inequality, but it does not appear that the reality is that old depressed areas are becoming less depressed and new depressed areas are being created. There just doesn't seem to be very much tendency towards convergence of the existing depressed areas over the last 25 or 30 years. And there's even as much argument for divergence and reductions in levels of employment, levels of good things in depressed areas as there is for the process of convergence. And again, you can look at a range of different questions. You can discuss what the right indicators of distress are to use, but the basic fact that it's not getting better seems to me to be largely unarguable. Third, it seems clear that, and this is related to two and to one, second fact and to the first fact, that the propensity for migration to take place has diminished quite substantially. That for all the discussion of how it's a more dynamic and flexible and whatnot world, in fact, the propensity for migration to take place from areas that are troubled to areas that are not troubled has declined very substantially, and there's not much evidence that that is likely to turn around. Further and more controversially, my own reading of the evidence would be that it is far from clear that an increase in the rate of migration would make the world a better place. As Bartik pointed out, out-migration means reduced employment in construction. Construction is a major employer of the less skilled. If you increase the rate of out-migration, you will increase the tendency for construction jobs to be destroyed in areas that are disadvantaged. If that's a continuing process, that's a further source of disadvantage. Second, as could be, but I haven't, probably someone has done it and I haven't seen it, could be formalized, they're what I would call exit, voice, and loyalty effects, or what someone else would call selection effects. When out-migration takes place, it is likely to be the most able, the most catalytic, the most skilled, who are most likely to out-migrate, and what's left behind is then an increasingly distressed, increasingly ill-led, increasingly uncatalyzed population. So I think it is relatively clear, it's completely clear that out-migration is not happening. It is far from clear that if you could incrementally increase the rate of out-migration that you would make things better. The nature of the uncertainty, if you look at it from a longer run point of view, might be posed by asking the question, what do we think about the distribution of the nation's leading economists? If we moved half of the nation's leading economists who are currently in the top 4 departments to the next 20 economics departments, would the world be a better place or a worse place? On the one hand, there'd be some significant catalytic effect. One would assume, probably on net, it was a good thing for the world when Paul Samuelson moved from Harvard to MIT 70 years ago. On the other hand, one would assume that there's some substantial agglomeration benefit in the training of graduate students in a variety of other things that comes from people being together. I would defy anyone to think that they knew for sure whether concentrating or deconcentrating the nation's talented economists would make economic science progress more rapidly. And it seems to me that a similar kind of uncertainty surrounds discussions of whether we should have one Silicon Valley or whether we should have 6. fourth thing that I think is entirely clear is that however important these issues are around the world, and one thought these issues were half a dozen years ago, one has to think that they are substantially more important today. The consequences of what we are describing is what drove the election of not just Donald Trump, but also the Brexit outcome in the United Kingdom, also the rise of fascists in significant parts of Central Europe, also plausibly the increase in Hindu nationalism in India, the increase in Islamic radicalism in Turkey, and I could proliferate examples. That it is the disaffection of distant non-cosmopolitans who live away from major prospering capital cities that is the source of populist nationalism, anti-internationalism, reduced global cooperation, and increased incentives to certainly trade wars and possibly conflicts going well beyond trade wars around the world. So however serious and consequential one thought this set of problems were 5 years ago, it seems to me as a subject for attention and analysis of economists, the attention has to be that much greater. I commend the Boston Fed for hosting this conference. I think it is an enormously negative commentary on the economics profession, that if I desired to identify high quality, thoughtful research on the question of whether it would be a good or bad idea for the US government to issue 50-year bonds rather than 30-year bonds, a question that I judge to be of roughly no substantial social consequence, I could find vastly more IQ power that has been applied to the term structure of interest rates than to the spatial distribution of economic activity. And that shows that we live in ways that are consistent with what we preach, and our profession responds to financial incentives. I think what I have said suggests that one should have some very strong presumption in favor of treating this as a serious problem, discussing it as a serious problem, and being in favor of doing things rather than being in favor of finding good reasons not to do things. I salute the energetic thoughtfulness and research that has gone into pointing up the many, many problems with place-based policies of the past, but confess that I prefer to regard it as useful thinking to improve future efforts rather than as a reason not to try. Here are some thoughts about what I might call broader aperture policies directed at place-based concerns. Number one, let's outlaw or substantially offset business tax incentives to attract the most lucrative businesses. It is roughly a crime that Boston can afford to give vastly greater targeted incentives to the General Electric Corporation to relocate its headquarters in Boston than can communities with higher unemployment and more social distress. why doesn't the federal government propose a policy? And if this idea was brought to me by somebody else, I could point up 7 ambiguities and problems and difficulties and crudities in the suggestion I'm about to make. But why doesn't the federal government place a 100% tax on receipts from state tax credits and in state and local state tax credits and incentives directed at attracting business given by communities in the upper half of the distribution of socioeconomic well-being? The first rule of holes is stop digging. Why should we allow those who are more fortunate to be bribed, to use their good fortune to bribe the movement of businesses from distressed Connecticut to much less fortunate Boston? I'm going to go over my time. Second, education. John L. Lewis said maybe the smartest thing that's ever been said about this kind of topic about 75 years ago, when he was discussing the fact that even then coal was on a downtrend. He said, jobs for the fathers, not for the sons. And he basically said that he was going to fight like hell to preserve coal mining jobs for the generation of current coal miners. But the solution for the children of current coal miners was not to preserve coal mining jobs, it was to create in them the capacity. Why don't we have a major federal countercyclical program of support for education in distressed areas, in areas where the cost of education is high? It is a tragedy. It is wrong that we tell people who live in Flint, Michigan, that yeah, it's good for everybody to have lower priced cars, so there's going to be imports of cars. That's basically right. And so we're going to have lower priced cars, we're going to have better cars, and your plant is going to have to close. Like, maybe that's okay. But when we go the next step and we say there's not going to be calculus at your local high school anymore because we can't afford to raise property taxes to prohibitive levels, and the property tax base is shrinking because house prices are going down, that is not reasonable, and that is not just, and that is not fair, and it is easy to understand why the people of Flint, Michigan are in rebellion against a system and that is producing that kind of outcome. I don't know what exactly the right answers are, but the idea that there is no systematic federal effort to support better education in the places that have been hardest hit and that are hardest hit is roughly indefensible. Most important book that's been written this year about American public policy, in my view, is Professor Markovitz's book about meritocracy, that basically makes the point that meritocracy loses a lot of its appeal when merit can be bought. And the people in this room can all afford to buy merit for their children. Buy merit for their children with the summer camps they go to, buy merit for their children with the instruction they provide, buy merit for their children with the SAT tutors who in America's major cities cost 3 times as much as the top flight child psychiatrist, buy merit for their children with the summer experiences that are central to getting into Ivy League schools. What happens at the family level is also happening at the locality level, and we are doing nothing as a country to prevent that mechanism from generating ever more inequality going on. Third, automatic stabilizers. Every macroeconomist who's kind of doing it is thinking about some version of the idea that the interest rate's only 2%, interest rates are supposed to come down 5% when they have recessions. That's not going to happen when we have the next recession. Therefore, we need to use fiscal policy. Congress will do something stupid when it's supposed to use fiscal policy, and the stupid thing they'll do, they'll also do slowly. So we need to strengthen automatic stabilizers. Why don't we be thinking about automatic stabilizers that operate in a non-uniform way nationally, that disproportionately target the places that have the highest unemployment and the places where unemployment is rising most rapidly? And the only one we've got like this, or the principal one we've got like this, is the one that pays people not to work. Unemployment insurance, which has, shall we say, supply side problems in terms of non-work being addicting. At the very least, it can be countercyclical revenue sharing. It can be countercyclical adjustment of tax schedules. There's no law that says that tax schedules can't be modified across places. Number 4, why isn't the set of programs, the EITC, the complement to the EITC on the employer side, subsidies for hiring, why don't we have such measures that vary in some way geographically? To be fair, we get a bit of this because the price and wage level is lower in some places than others and tends to be lower in depressed places. So we have a bit of this edge whenever we provide for programs in constant nominal amounts. But there's no reason why I can see why that should not be done on a larger scale. A last thought. Here's what the Federal Reserve ought to be highlighting rather than occasionally mentioning. We don't know that much about the Phillips curve, actually. We're not 100% certain, actually, that there is a Phillips curve, God's truth. But we kind of are pretty confident that if you put more demand into San Francisco, it's going to put more wages and prices up more rapidly than if you put more demand into West Virginia. We're pretty sure of that. And that's all you need to know to think that in terms of the objectives of the Federal Reserve System, maximizing employment with price stability, that shifting more demand from San Francisco to West Virginia will be availing in terms of achieving maximum employment and price stability. The Federal Reserve can't make there be a lower interest rate in West Virginia than San Francisco. That doesn't work. But there are a lot of things that can happen, and it is the objective of the Fed. And so why isn't the Fed telling us every week that that kind of shift in demand would promote maximum employment and price stability? And by the way, even if these ideas are complicated, and even if these ideas aren't perfect, and there are lots of problems, and if I was in a different mode, I could provide 9 objections to each one of them. At least the people who live in the parts of our country that are increasingly left behind would be left with the feeling that somebody was listening, somebody was thinking, and somebody was caring. And that would matter a great deal as well. So I want to conclude by just congratulating the Boston Fed for hosting this conference and making a plea that we don't be consumed in the minutia of nuance with respect to either the precise description of the policy or the precise analytics of which $3 billion program we are going to have, because there's probably no issue more important for the political economy of the next 15 years, not just in the United States, but around the world, than what happens in the areas that feel rightly that they are falling behind and increasingly left apart. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. Again, put your tent up, and if I don't see you, give a shout. Emily?
Hi, Emily Pachetti, former student, Dr. Summers.
Former
student.
Ah.
Oh. Thank you for your comments. I'm trying to make a link between your comments without being too nuanced and David's comments about education. So, David, I heard you talking about subsidizing employers or subsidizing workers' wages in kind of perhaps targeted industries or whatever that local market looks like. And I heard you say, Dr. Summers, that that you have this idea for some major federal counter-cyclical investments to subsidize education in distressed areas. And I'm trying to put the two together and ask about community colleges. And if there's an opportunity, or if I know there's some isolated programs in Ohio that work with community colleges to, incentivize work with local employers and all of that. And I was wondering what role community colleges could potentially play in some national policy, to your points.
I've got a policy which I've done a pretty good job of sticking to, which is that every semester, as long as I get invited to one, I go give a talk and spend half a day at a community college talking about whatever they want to talk about having to do with economics. So I've got that level of knowledge with respect to the community college world. I visited Northern Essex Community College, North Essex Community College earlier this week. It's an institution, shall we say, not blessed with the kind of facilities that Harvard University is blessed with, but with teachers who frankly seem rather more dedicated to their students than the average professor at Harvard. The president there says that they have a program that costs in the hundreds of dollars, the high hundreds of dollars per student, perhaps a little bit more than that, that they're able to afford to provide to some of their students, but not all of their students, and that it's more or less randomly allocated, and so they can do a RCT and evaluate it, that raises the successful completion rate by 20 percentage points. That I have not exposed that claim to critical scrutiny, so I'm passing it on carefully. If for $3,000, let alone $800, you can raise community college completion rates by anything remotely approaching 20%, if you make some adjustment for what the extra wage is, what the reduction is, it is a fantastic investment in returns. And I suspect we are inordinately underinvesting in doing the right kinds of things with respect to community colleges. I think the influence of elite higher education on the higher education debate is at best mixed. During my time as president of Harvard, I was a big advocate for liberal arts education, and I think liberal arts education in the right place, in the right way, in the right time is an extraordinarily valuable thing. But whenever any political figure suggests that some attention should be paid to whether whether the average American receiving a community college degree or some other college or even a 4-year degree is actually being connected with a job or actually being trained in a skill that will have some marketability, roughly speaking, the nation's higher education elite goes into apoplexy that their intellectual tradition is being traduced. I think it's the most embarrassing position that elite higher education has taken since it universally opposed the GI Bill, which it did. And that was a bad elitist idea, and the current approach is a bad elitist idea. So I'm all for what you're saying. I think the logic of what I said would very much say that we should be working especially hard at supporting community colleges in regions that are distressed. Kids who go to community college live at home. The community colleges are near their homes. I'll bet you'd find that the worse the place was economically, the faster the community college tuition went up, and that's roughly crazy. And so I would be all for more investment in community colleges, more standards for community colleges around economic results, and more emphasis and more targeting towards the areas that are left behind.
Can I just say a couple things? I think, touching that, I refer you to some of Harry Holz's work. Harry has done work for years thinking about community colleges, and I think it's not just that I think you're absolutely right that the perception about teachers care about the students more. That's part of it, but it's also they're just connected to the job market, and they're connected to the local job market. And we know the less skilled, the job market is more local. This is what they do. They're just much more nimble. That said, there's some structural problems. So California is a great community college system. It's now cheap or free for almost everybody, but they still, for example, fund every enrollment hour the same, whether you're an English student or a nursing student or someone learning how to install solar panels, right? And the latter two cost a lot more, and the jobs are a lot better. So there's things we can do to fix it. I think the counter-cyclical idea of course, makes sense because the opportunity cost of being in school is lower then, and that makes a lot of sense. And just, I think your point about, the view of elite education, I think really emphasizes someone. When I did my college trip with my son, we went to Amherst College. I won't offend anybody, but in the little cushy admissions office, the admissions officer very proudly said, we train you for nothing but prepare you for everything. Which I think, and for our kids, that's probably exactly the right thing, right? they're going to go into jobs using a lot of critical, abstract, analytical thinking. But that's not what we should be doing for most people, clearly.
Prabal?
Great, thank you. Prabal Chakrabarty, Boston Fed. Just a comment and a question. One of the things several presenters have talked about, and I think Mr. Newmark, you had skipped over this slide, the importance of a local, collaborative, community-engaged, sort of intentional capacity. So there's a lot of terms in there. But just to say, when you have a policy, and a lot of you talk about different federal policies, where it lands, how the community and those affected by the policy are involved in its design or its implementation, I think it's critical and important. And when President Rosengren spoke yesterday about the Working Cities and Working Communities efforts that the Fed is doing, part of that is to build this table of people like the president of Northern Essex Community College, who's actually involved in one of these efforts in Lawrence. It's to build this table of people to understand how the system works, their role in the system, so that efforts aren't siloed. Now, that isn't going to work without a sensible state policy and federal policy. But I just think missing from some of the discussion yesterday and today is just the importance of having that local collaboration, that local table that's an effective place. Now, maybe in some of the rural areas that needs to be more regional. Maybe there aren't the right numbers of anchor institutions or hospitals or universities that need to be there. But just as a comment that might be a necessary condition for any of these policies to have the effectiveness. My question is around your proposal around the job subsidies. To what extent a program like this could be effective if the subsidies were focused on making low-wage work and those jobs better, as opposed to trying to solely create new, maybe middle skill or jobs that pay higher wages? Is there some role in that subsidy plan to actually make low-wage jobs that exist already in retail hospitality better? So that's my comment, my question.
Gosh, I mean, I don't know exactly what form that would take. Certainly some of the minimum wage advocates argue that we will bump employers to being high road employers. Possible. I just think we have any evidence in this. I think on your first point, I think this kind of goes back to what Larry was saying about what economists study and what they don't study. It's got to be true that sort of how things are implemented locally matters, and it's also got to be true that it's almost impossible to do systematic research on this. So we just don't know very much. I mean, people in other disciplines do. They go in, and people in education do case studies of administration of community colleges. Some of the work I talked about, where about sort of the connections to the local labor market comes out of sort of this qualitative evidence of 7 schools. It's just not what we do, and I think we just need to integrate a little better with that kind of research to emphasize that point, that just dropping money doesn't, drop money on community colleges, it will help to some extent, but drop money on community colleges that have a specific plan to assess, job needs in the labor market and hire the right people to train for those jobs has to work better, but it's hard. We don't have much research on it. It's just hard to do large-scale data analysis.
So I guess this is a question mostly for Larry. I think that something that unifies all 3 of the talks in this session is we should find smart ways to reduce misery. There's real misery out there. Let's find smart ways to address it. I think you went one step further, which is to say, if we can do this, there are going to be a lot of really important political benefits that come out of this, in the sense that people will recognize that this is being done. And I'm a little bit less certain about that second step. There are already, and as a lot of people have mentioned, there are huge fiscal transfers that are already happening. That's even in nominal terms if you thought about it in real terms, since in the big cities they face higher price indices. The sort of favoring of some of these areas is much larger than would be suggested only by the nominal amounts. And I don't sense any great gratitude that's coming back from that. And so I'm at least skeptical that the political benefits in terms of appreciation of what is being done for them are really going to come out of such an effort.
You might be right. By by far the largest transfer just comes from the fact that we collect federal taxes in proportion to income, and some areas are lower, have lower incomes, and so they pay less. No one announces anything about that. And by the way, that one, if you took account of the lower price level, it's kind of less true. But the main point is that one we don't. Nobody sees us doing much of anything about that. Nobody sees the federal government coming and putting money into your schools. They see the school getting cut. So I guess my answer would be some of this is about whether you're on the level or on the rate of change. And the stuff we do is all on the level. And people think about the rate of change. That is, the tax thing is based on the relative income of your place, not whether your place moved down in the last N years. There's precious little publicity that attaches to it. I bet you 10, but not $50, that if somebody did a study of political attitudes in the Tennessee Valley, they'd find that the TVA kind of brought the Tennessee Valley into a more constructive, broadly pro-American, less parochial viewpoint relative to where it was. My impression is that Appalachia was probably a more constructive in its attitude towards the whole country place when the Kennedys and Johnson were focused on the problem of Appalachia than when it subsequently went out of focus. So on the one hand, I'm not sure you're right. On the other hand, I guess I worked principally for two presidents. From Bill Clinton, I learned it's a good idea to get caught trying. And from Barack Obama, I learned better is good. And so I think you're right, and there's always a risk of overselling. And I tried to be, as I spoke, when I reminded people that I could think of half a dozen objections to each of the things I was saying, to be cautionary about the fact that I was, in some sense, overselling. But I guess I would be pretty surprised if historians looked back on the first quarter of the 21st century and said, America really wasted a lot of money and wasted a lot of effort in excessive efforts to help the parts of the country that were left behind. That seems an unlikely verdict of history.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Lei Ding, I think from Philadelphia Fed. Since we are talking about place-based policies, I was surprised that we have not talked about, I think, the Opportunity Zone.
Sorry, say it again.
The Opportunity Zone project, the program. You mentioned, I think, but you did not talk too much. Based on your research of Enterprise Zone and other programs, so what would be the potential risk, opportunities of this program, I think?
I was simply responding to the fact that we don't have any evidence yet. We had a nice series of anecdotes in the New York Times, which of course looked terrible, but it was anecdotes, and we don't know to what extent they were selecting, sort of the projects that look like the most egregious violations of what the goal of the program actually was. The research I know best that is closest, I think, is Matt Friedman's work on the new market tax credit, which had sort of investment vehicles, although it wasn't all real estate investment. Had kind of a nice design built in because there was sort of a threshold for eligibility. And he finds some modest positive effects in reducing poverty at a very expensive price. But I mean, it's but I talked to him because he's in the office next door to me. He thinks trying to create jobs through encouraging real estate investment, obviously short-term construction jobs, to go to your point, you create, but long-term doesn't seem like the right policy. But it remains to be seen. I mean, we have no serious evaluations yet.
Do you have one last question? Do we have another minute for a last question? That was remarkably short answer and question.
I'll try to do the same. This is a question for Larry. You said, Brennan Greeley, the Financial Times, you said that we absolutely know that stimulus will make a much bigger difference in West Virginia than it would in San Francisco. So after the recession, as a percentage of GDP growth, state and local spending was one of the last things to recover. Should the Fed be given the power by Congress to buy state and local debt?
I haven't thought about that. She just held up a sign that said 5 minutes, which I'm not going to indulge myself in a 5-minute answer. So let the record show that I'm giving back some of the time that I took earlier. I'd be a little surprised if getting the Fed involved in deciding which places that are financially distressed are good credits and which places are bad, and getting the Fed involved in deciding to take credit risk was a particularly good idea or bad idea. If I had responsibility at the Fed, I'd probably tell somebody that as they thought about macroprudential policy and countercyclical policy and all the various instruments of regulatory policy, the fact that in some social sense, a little more credit to go do things in West Virginia seemed more worthwhile than bidding further up the price of condos in San Francisco, is a thought that might in some way possibly inform the policy of the Federal Reserve as it worked with financial institutions. I'm not endorsing that idea, but I think the first paper that was written on that in that area would probably have a higher marginal social value than the 100th paper that was written on, the liquidity ratio for counterparties to derivative transactions, and the like. Whether I'd actually have the Federal Reserve doing it, whether I would have the Federal Reserve, I'm sure that if I was doing things for the Fed, I would have the Fed be involved in addition to the 93rd nowcast produced by a regional Fed and the 11th R-star calculation, I would do a calculation of adjusted economic slack that took some account of the fact that going from 8% unemployment or 7% unemployment in a place to 8% unemployment was probably contributing less inflationary pressure than going from 2.5% to 1.5% in a different place, and producing some estimates of capacity and the like that took account of that would seem to me to be a worthwhile project. I think having the Fed buy municipal bonds doesn't strike me as responsive to what I think is likely to be the problem. I think a different question is there to do the way state and local constitutions are written, with the emphasis on yearly balanced budgets, but the provision for capital budgets, lead to excessive regional procyclicality? And could something be done to mitigate that problem? That's a problem that I think would be a good problem for Fed research departments to work on.
Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you. I think last comments are coming.
Okay, thanks very much. I won't hold us up very long, but I just wanted to remind you all about the conference evaluation forms. If you have any comments on what we could do better, what you particularly liked, different titles for panel discussions, that's where to do it. Also, name tags, if you could sort of leave your name tag somewhere. The Fed does print the money, but we do have a budget constraint. And we'll have lunch now in the cafe seating area. Final thing I want to do is that on behalf of Jeff Tutel, Giovanni Olive, and me, with the conference organizers, we want to thank the people who really did the work to bring this conference off. There's an enormous number of details to get right, and the team did great. For logistics and conference support, Keith Barnachet, Randy Kavanaugh, Melissa Gentry, Jeff Kelly, Morgan Glazer, Sonia Pierre, Bojana Rozic, and Sam Tugendhoft. We had a great audiovisual team as well. Shaquila Blake, Peter Davis, Steve Osimahai, is that about right pronunciation? I hope so. And the whole Bromfield production team. For program, editorial, and web design, I personally think they knocked it out of the park this year. Alexander Cronin, Stephen Greenstein, and Elizabeth Murray. And finally, thanks to Sodexo Food Services, which I know supplies me with about 90% of the meals I eat on a regular basis. And they'll supply you with the next meal in the next room. So thank you very much. And thanks to you for coming as well.